Chapter 2289. The higher a cultivator's cultivation realm was, the more egoistic they would become. At the level of a tribulation realm expert, the weight of one's ego could even suppress the outside world, all worlds, all space-time, and even the state of chaos. How could such an existence easily sacrifice his own interests for other things, or even other living beings? However, that young cultivator sealed himself in the depths of the Tao Master's prison for the sake of the Tao Master's path. His resolve was shocking. Of course, although he was shocked, Luo Fan obviously didn't have too much of a sense of recognition. At this moment, he only smiled faintly and turned his gaze to look at his fourth senior brother, who seemed to be eager to do something. The fourth senior brother felt a chill down his spine when he was glanced at by Luo Fan, and felt uneasy from the bottom of his heart. What's going on? Isn't the war over? Why do I suddenly feel so uneasy? Such thoughts flashed through his mind, and he could not help but look around to see if there was any danger that he had overlooked. However, it was obvious that he naturally could not gain anything at this time. After all, Luo Fan was in his own world group at this time, and his gaze had already been obscured by the sense of existence of the world group itself. Although he was extremely confident in his own intuition, this opportunity was too rare. It was so rare that fourth senior brother had no choice but to suppress his intuition. He called out, "Senior brother, please wait." At the same time, he walked towards the waxen middle-aged man. The waxen middle-aged man was about to activate his power and ascend back to his original level. At this time, he could not help but frown when he heard the fourth senior brother's words. After all, they were all disciples of the Tao Master, so he finally stopped to wait for the fourth senior brother's words. "Junior brother, what can I do for you? I'm quite busy now." Seeing that the fourth senior brother was in front of him, he spoke without waiting for the other party to say anything. The fourth senior brother's attitude could not be more obvious. He quickly said, "Senior brother, what I want to say is the identity of the ruler of this level." Hearing this, the waxen middle-aged man's expression changed, and he said, "Senior brother, what I want to say is the identity of the ruler of this level." The middle-aged man's expression changed when he heard this, and he said, "Humph, don't tell me you want me to help you take back your identity." The fourth senior brother opened his mouth and hesitated for a moment before saying, "If senior brother thinks it's too troublesome, then forget it." The middle-aged man laughed coldly when he heard this. "The reason you were able to become the fourth senior brother was because we felt that you possessed the ability to control this level. It's not that we think you should have that power. If you can control this level, then it's your ability. If you can't, then it's your incompetence." As he spoke, he couldn't be bothered with the fourth senior brother anymore. The aura on his body surged, and his body started to gradually disappear from the fourth level. In the blink of an eye, he had already disappeared without a trace. Only the fourth senior brother, who had an extremely depressed expression on his face, was left on the spot. At this moment, his mind was in a mess. After all, in his opinion, the idea he just proposed should be as easy as lifting a hand for the waxen middle-aged man. If the waxen middle-aged man was willing, he only needed to make a slight move to naturally deal with Luo Fan and push him back to the position of overlord. However, in the face of such a simple task, the man had actually rejected him so decisively. This choice made him extremely puzzled, and he felt inexplicably scared. He did not believe a word of the waxen middle-aged man's reason. As the fourth senior brother of the Tao Master, he knew the nature of the Tao Master's disciples very well. For almost all the disciples of the Tao Master, no matter how fierce the internal competition was, as long as it was against the external forces, they would generally stick together. In other words, under normal circumstances, not to mention that he was originally the ruler of the fourth level. It was just that his identity had been taken away by someone else. Even if he was just an ordinary disciple of the Tao Master, as long as he wanted to, there was a chance that the waxen middle-aged man could help him become a ruler, as long as he could show enough strength. However, the final result was like this. The waxen middle-aged man had actually rejected his proposal in such a righteous manner. This situation was unbelievable and incomprehensible no matter how he looked at it. Could it be that he is also not sure that he can defeat that expert? Suddenly, his thoughts turned, and he finally thought of such a possibility that he instinctively wanted to directly deny. No, that's impossible. He is at least an expert of the 6th level, and that rogue cultivator is only at the 4th level. Although he has mastered some special powers and seems to be a bit stronger than the ordinary experts of the 4th level, he is at most at the level of the 5th level. How can he be comparable to the experts of the 6th level? Just as he was thinking about this, an indescribable force directly pressed down on his body, making him feel that his body and mind, from the inside out, from top to bottom, were all under an unimaginable pressure. All the movements of his body completely stopped at this moment. The power that was originally at his whim seemed to be separated from him by a barrier that he could feel but could not break through. No matter what he did, he could not really touch it. He was quite familiar with this feeling. For a moment, all the doubts that had accumulated before were swept away. It turns out that he is the one who makes me feel uneasy. With this thought, a figure gradually appeared in front of him from nothingness, from an illusion to a reality. It was none other than Luo Fan. You seem to know a lot of things that I don't know. Can you tell me? Luo Fan came in front of the 4th senior brother and said lightly to him, hearing this seemingly request, but in fact, it was simply a coercion. The 4th senior brother's face was full of bitterness. What do you want to know, Your Excellency? After a long time, he said with difficulty. Well, let's start with the so-called war agreement. Luo Fan thought for a moment and said. The 4th senior brother said honestly, I don't know much about the war agreement. I only know that it is an agreement signed by many big worlds about their respective paths of becoming a town master, a sage, or a true sage. It is said that it stipulates the rules of war between each other. For example, under what circumstances can you start a war? Under what circumstances will you be attacked by a group of people, and so on? What about the specifics? Luo Fan asked noncommittally. The 4th senior brother had no choice but to tell everything he knew about the war agreement without reservation. When he finished, Luo Fan was also sure that the 4th senior brother was not just being modest when he said that he did not know much. He really didn't know much. He only knew a little about the content of the war agreement. Only a few of the rules could be explained clearly. He did not know how many big worlds had signed this agreement, how many rules there were in total, and what the specific content was. Although he was not very satisfied, Luo Fan already felt that he had gained a lot from the 4th senior brother. There are thousands of rules that he knows. The number of big worlds involved in making this agreement must be extremely terrifying. Otherwise, there would not be so many strict rules. He thought to himself, with an inexplicably complicated look on his face. There was joy, worry, excitement, and fear mixed in it. Just a few words of the rules that the 4th senior brother knew had stipulated countless strange situations, involving many kinds of things that obviously could not appear in the same big world. Obviously, this could only happen when there was an extremely shocking number of people. And when the number increased, there would naturally be more changes. Naturally, there would be more experts like the Jailbreaker King. For Luo Fan, who had just seen the horror of the Jailbreaker King, it was impossible for his mood not to change. While Luo Fan's mind was in turmoil, the 4th senior brother's mind was spinning. He was constantly thinking about how to escape from his control and regain his freedom. After a while, his eyes suddenly lit up. Now that the invaders who restricted ascension have disappeared, I think I should be able to ascend. Perhaps I should choose to ascend. As soon as this thought appeared, it lingered in his mind like maggots on a tarsal bone. The proportion of his mind became heavier and heavier. In the end, when he saw that Luo Fan was gradually recovering, the 4th senior brother finally made up his mind. At this moment, his heart trembled slightly, and a strange power began to rise from the world group that belonged to him in the distance. It directly spread towards the entire world group, and in the blink of an eye, it had already enveloped the entire world group. Immediately afterward, the power from the world group began to tremble and gradually fused with the endless worlds, and space-time it enveloped. It was clearly trying to completely integrate the entire world group into the power refined from the world group, and meet the requirements of the fourth level of ascension. For ordinary itinerant cultivators, it would take a lot of hard work and a lot of time to achieve this. However, for the fourth senior brother, who had controlled the domain of the Tao Master for countless trillions of years, he had long met the requirements to complete this step. At any time, as long as he wanted to, he could complete this last step and meet the requirements of ascension. At this moment, Luo Fan sensed something and returned to his senses. He glanced over, and his eyes had already locked onto the world group that was separated by an unknown amount of power of creation, and a faint smile appeared on his face. "Are you planning to ascend now?" he said with a faint smile. When the fourth senior brother heard this, he felt a chill run down his spine. He did not expect Luo Fan to have such a profound control over the fourth level. Even though he had done everything so covertly, Luo Fan could still sense it instantly. In his original thought, Luo Fan should have waited until he had begun the process of ascension, or even until most of his body had ascended to the fifth level, before the changes that he had deliberately hidden would occur. What will he do? Will he teach me a lesson, or seal me, or throw me into the Tao Master's prison, or even kill me? This idea emerged in his mind at this time, and his face instantly became extremely perturbed. However, to his surprise, Luo Fan did not pay attention to his actions at all, and just asked, "So, according to your understanding, why would there be wars between different worlds? Or, more specifically, why would there be wars between different paths of Tao Master?" Only existences at the true divine level could ignore the state of chaos and communicate freely. Therefore, this kind of war that appeared in the state of chaos as a stage must be led by existences at the true divine level. In other words, even if it was not a true divine who took action, the contradictions, schemes, invasions, resistance, fights, killings, creation, and destruction between different paths of Tao Master should be tacitly approved or even encouraged by true divine. However, this was also what made Luo Fan feel puzzled, because for a true divine, it was meaningless at all. For a true divine who was omnipotent, omniscient, and immortal, even if it was a vast world, they only needed to try a few times to create it. As for anything that Luo Fan understood, even if it was as wonderful as the chaotic origin spiritual treasure, or even the devices, treasures, power, and technology above the chaotic origin spiritual treasure, it did not seem to be too precious or rare for them. Under such circumstances, what could they gain by taking advantage of the wars between different worlds? What reason did they have to start such a war if they could not get anything that moved them and made them willing to waste time and energy to pursue? Even if this kind of war was not at the level that Luo Fan could participate in, it was really too low for them. Luo Fan, who couldn't figure this out, felt that this situation was somewhat illusory. It was like a castle on the beach, as if everything could be engulfed and flattened by a wave. Hearing Luo Fan's question, fourth senior brother was stunned and said, "What do you mean? Isn't the war because of interests? This must be a rare benefit that can be obtained by defeating other paths of Tao Masters. But what is the significance of such a benefit to a Tao Master?" Luo Fan said lightly. Upon hearing this, the fourth senior brother was first stunned, but then his expression suddenly changed. Fourth senior brother was obviously not stupid, since he could climb to the position of fourth senior brother from an ordinary disciple of a Tao Master. Soon, he figured out why Luo Fan asked this question. Chapter 2290. In order to escape from Luo Fan's clutches as quickly as possible, fourth senior brother had accelerated the process of integrating his own world group into the power extracted from it to the limit. When he was talking to Luo Fan, this process was not stopped. It was still going on autonomously, constantly melting the heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time in the world group into the power. At this time, during the process of this conversation, the world group had unknowingly completed the entire integration process and started the final process of ascension. At this moment, fourth senior brother, who was in a daze, began to gradually become illusory, as if he was gradually being pulled away from the fourth layer of the Tao Master's road by an invisible force. Luo Fan did not care about the changes in his fourth senior brother. He just looked at him with an inexplicable gaze. This calm look was a world of difference from fourth senior brother's original look of extreme anxiety, as if he wanted to seize the opportunity to transcend time. Fourth senior brother's previous nervousness almost turned into a joke. "Aren't you going to stop me? I haven't given you the answer you want to know, have I?" Fourth senior brother finally could not help but ask at the last moment. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, "First of all, you don't necessarily know the answer I want to know. Even if you give it to me, it may not be the right answer. Secondly, do you think your ascension will be successful at this time?" Fourth senior brother's expression involuntarily changed. Is there something strange? Didn't many high-level experts who went against the flow of time and ascended back? If they can go back, there should be no problem for my ascension. Thinking of this, he could not help but become nervous. At this time, his expression suddenly changed, and his body, which had gradually become illusory, began to solidify again. Unknowingly, his real body had already condensed in front of Luo Fan. It seems that it is not going well. Looking at his change, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said. Fourth senior brother seemed to wake up from a dream and asked in surprise, "Why is this happening? Why is it that their return is fine, but my ascension is met with such strong resistance?" "It seems that you have not carefully studied the war agreement," Luo Fan said indifferently. "What agreement?" Fourth senior brother didn't know how to react. He was the one who told Luo Fan those parts of the war agreement. Now, Luo Fan took what he told him and said that he hadn't studied the agreement at all. Wasn't this completely the opposite of the truth? Shouldn't he be the one saying these words? "You don't seem to care about the various restrictions before and after the war," Luo Fan said calmly. Upon hearing this, the fourth senior brother was slightly shocked. He suddenly recalled a rule in the war agreement that lay in the depths of his memory. That was, in order to maintain the stability of the town master's path during the early, middle, and late stages of the war, as long as the situation was not stable, the first thing that both sides of the war needed to do was to ensure the safety of the cultivators in the Ascension Passage. And the Ascenders also needed to abide by the war agreement. Under the condition that the other side guaranteed their safety, they must not leak any information about the war. Safety. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. How to ensure their safety? Blocking it completely so that no one could use it was naturally the best guarantee. After all, if there were no cultivators in the Ascension Passage, they could do whatever they wanted and it wouldn't violate the agreement. In contrast, if the cultivators entered the Ascension Passage, it would just be a little bit of trouble. Not only did they need to ensure that the fluctuations of the war would not affect the inside of the passage, but they also needed to ensure that the passage itself would not be distorted due to the impact of the war. Compared with this, things like taking care of newborns were not enough at all. Thinking of this, the fourth senior brother could not help but sigh secretly. If they really applied this agreement, the situation would be unpredictable. When the situation stabilized, it would be completely uncertain. Maybe everything would stabilize in the next breath, and they would be able to ascend to any place freely. However, it was also possible that the situation would remain the same after hundreds of millions of years, or even become even more unstable. Of course, there was no contradiction between the fact that they could not ascend and the cultivators who came in the opposite direction being able to go back. Because the cultivators who came in the opposite direction were not protected by the war agreement. In other words, even if they died in the Ascension Passage, the war agreement would not care at all. Therefore, they could leave the fourth floor at this time and succeed. The fourth senior brother forced a smile that looked like he was crying and said, "I was impulsive just now. Please forgive me, senior." Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, "Don't be so impulsive next time." Sure. The fourth senior brother could only say, "Okay, answer my previous question. According to your understanding, why would the Dao Master be interested in the war between the Dao Masters and even encourage it?" Luo Fan just asked. Hearing this, the fourth senior brother's expression changed slightly. Obviously, even though he was more familiar with the Dao Master because he was a disciple of the Dao Master, he could not figure out this question at all. However, It was clear that he was not qualified to refuse Luo Fan's question. He could only use his brain and use all his efforts to think about the possible reasons behind it. When a living creature was forced, its potential would be more perfectly stimulated. This was also applicable to the fourth senior brother. Under the pressure of Luo Fan, his thinking became extremely fast. Countless ideas and inspiration constantly flashed in the depths of his heart, and all kinds of things that he had not thought or even dared to think about began to emerge out of thin air. Finally, an answer appeared in his heart. "Game," he murmured, his eyes full of shock. Even he could not believe it when he thought of this answer. His heart was full of disbelief, and he only felt that if this answer was the truth, it would be too scary. However, he instinctively knew that except for this reason, there seemed to be no other reason that could explain their behavior. "Game." Luo Fan repeated his answer, and his eyes first showed a shock, and then he suddenly understood. Indeed, there seemed to be no other reason that could explain it except for the game. Even now, even he was extremely shocked, and even he did not dare to imagine the appearance of the high level, let alone the Tao Master's path, as a game prop. This kind of thing seemed unimaginable. But after thinking about it carefully, it seemed that only the existence of this level was qualified to be the game prop of the true sage. After all, it was the eternal, immortal, omniscient, omnipotent true sage. Perhaps, for a true sage, the Tao Master's path is just the meaning of a certain game software in a computer to an ordinary person. After a long time, he sighed and was the first to come to his senses. The feeling of being treated as an NPC in the game was quite unpleasant. However, he could only swallow his displeasure and obediently carry out the setting of the game. He kept climbing up the path of Tao Master, comprehending the mysteries that he needed to comprehend, and completing the breakthrough that he needed, so that he could finally transcend and become a master outside the game. With this explanation, it was obvious what those true sages and Tao Masters could gain from this kind of war. Obviously, they could get enough fun from here, and it could kill a large amount of time that they already had enough to waste. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, it did not take long for Luo Fan to completely eliminate all these distracting thoughts, and his expression and mood had completely returned to their original state. At this moment, he did not care about fourth senior brother. He turned around, and in the blink of an eye, he had already crossed the barrier of the endless power of creation and directly returned to his own world cluster. As he returned to this place, the fourth senior brother felt his entire body loosen up. The enormous mental pressure that had always existed when Luo Fan was still alive had dissipated, and his body and mind had once again regained their ease and flexibility. However, he did not need to care about this. At this time, he was still immersed in the answer to the question that he had received before. Compared with Luo Fan, who had rich experience in dealing with the existence of the true sage level, fourth senior brother, even if he was a disciple of a Tao Master, was far less experienced in this aspect. However, at this time, the more questions he had at the bottom of his heart, and these questions brought more and more answers that were completely different from the answers that occasionally flashed through his mind. And these many different answers gradually subverted his various understandings of heaven and earth, Tao Masters, and even the state of chaos. In this way, the depth of his thinking was greatly enhanced, and it released the reason that he thought he had been blinded. But at the same time, this drastic change in thinking also affected the core of his own cognition, and then caused the foundation of his cultivation to inexplicably shake. For a time, all kinds of strange fluctuations began to flow around his body. These fluctuations were like flowing water, constantly washing the endless power of creation around him, causing the power of creation to produce all kinds of indescribable distortions. Even his world cluster, which had completely fused with the power of his world cluster, had countless silhouettes leaking out, projecting onto the boundless chaotic creation energy around him, making it seem as if the creation energy was evolving his world cluster anew. The countless lights and shadows intertwined with the distortions and chaos, causing the scene to become even more chaotic. "Fourth senior brother, what's wrong with you?" A disciple of a Tao master who was on good terms with fourth senior brother saw that something was wrong and hurriedly tried to wake him up with Tao sounds. It was a pity that such Tao sounds could not even break through the various kinds of chaos around fourth senior brother, let alone penetrate his physical defense and directly into his heart. The reason for this was very simple. After fourth senior brother had integrated the power of the world cluster with the power of the world cluster, his cultivation realm had been greatly improved. It could be said that although he was still not comparable to the real cultivators on the 5th level, he had far surpassed almost everyone on the 4th level. When he was in such a state, when his emotions were agitated, the various power fluctuations and energy fluctuations were not something that could be broken through by ordinary means. His strange phenomenon attracted the attention of more and more cultivators. The rogue cultivators had rather complicated feelings towards fourth senior brother. Although he was now considered a companion, it was difficult for them to really treat him as a companion due to the accumulated contradictions over the years. As a result, they were rather indifferent towards fourth senior brother's strange behavior. At this moment, none of them came forward, and they just watched the various changes around his body from afar. However, it was different for the disciples of the Tao Masters. For them, fourth senior brother's management of them for billions of years had already left an extremely deep mark in their hearts. Seeing that fourth senior brother was in trouble, they rushed over from all directions, worried. Tao sounds, immortal sounds, and Sanskrit chants constantly rushed over, trying to break through the various kinds of chaos around fourth senior brother's body and into his heart to wake him up. However, it was obvious that the Tao sounds, celestial sounds, and Sanskrit chants were all insufficient when faced with the chaos that the fourth senior brother had unintentionally created. They were unable to produce any real effects, and they could not even touch his body, let alone awaken him. While chasing Cinderella, they could only watch the scope of the chaos become wider and wider, and the degree of the chaos also became more and more serious as time went by. In just a few days, the disciples of the Tao Masters outside could no longer see fourth senior brother in the middle of the chaos. In their eyes, they could only see an increasingly large chaotic world cluster that was constantly growing, gradually pushing them back. Finally, on a certain day after a few years, a strange vibration suddenly erupted from the depths of the chaotic world cluster. The vibration was so strange and so powerful that in a flash, it had already swept through the entire chaotic world cluster and even vaguely affected the creation power outside the world cluster. Following the vibration, all the disciples of the Tao Masters felt their bodies and minds relax, as if something good had happened. Chapter 2291. When everything calmed down, a vast, orderly group of worlds appeared in front of the disciples of the Tao Masters. Seeing this world group, the Tao Masters let out a long sigh. There was both regret and relief in this sigh. Regrettably, the appearance of this world group meant that the fourth senior brother, who had integrated the world group into the power of his own world group, had regressed. From the state of having completed the process of ascension, he had reverted to the state of an ordinary 4th level cultivator. But the relief was that although there was such a regression, at least his life was saved. That state that was originally close to chi deviation had already passed. No, this world group is a little different from the 4th senior brother's original world group. Suddenly, a Tao Master's disciple who was more familiar with the 4th senior brother exclaimed with a look of shock on his face. "What's going on? This world group seems to have changed." This was the thought that flashed through his mind. This thought sent chills down his spine. The world group in the 4th level was formed by the gathering of all the worlds and space-time that the cultivators had opened up in the past. It could be said that it was the condensation of all the cultivators' past experiences and history. Compared to the infinite possibilities of the future, the past was completely fixed. Under such circumstances, the many worlds, and space-time in the 4th level of the cultivator's world group should be difficult to change once they appeared. All along, the experience of the Tao Master's disciple told him that this was indeed correct. However, at this time, the 4th senior brother's world group completely overturned his understanding. The change in the structure of the world group itself was still secondary. Although this did not happen often, if a cultivator's mentality changed, it could be easily changed. What the Tao Master's disciple could not understand was that almost every world, and every piece of space-time in the Fourth Senior Brothers world group had undergone earth-shaking changes. At first glance, these worlds seemed to be no different from the past, but as long as one looked into the details, they would find that everything hidden behind the surface had changed. How is this possible? How can the past be changed? This was the only question left in the mind of the Tao Sovereign. An indescribable shock appeared on his face. Following his exclamation, the other disciples of the Tao Masters also began to notice the strangeness of the world cluster. Strange expressions appeared on their faces. Could it be that Fourth Senior Brother has been possessed? A disciple of a Tao Master made such a suggestion. It sounded absurd at first, but after careful consideration, it seemed to be possible. After all, in their understanding, such a change in the past could only happen when the Fourth Senior Brother suddenly changed. In this case, it seemed that only the Fourth Senior Brother's body could be possessed on an extremely deep level by some existence using a method that they could not understand. It can't be true, a Tao Master's disciple said in disbelief. We'll know once we test him. The disciple of the Tao Master who was closest to the Fourth Senior Brother gritted his teeth and said, with a thought, he raised his hand and a power that belonged to the world cluster was released from his hand. It turned into an invisible giant and directly crashed into the world cluster in front of him. Normally speaking, if the Fourth Senior Brother was still the Fourth Senior Brother, he would definitely be able to easily sense the aura contained in the power that belonged to him. Even if the Fourth Senior Brother was unhappy because of his actions, he would definitely show some mercy. However, if the Fourth Senior Brother was no longer the Fourth Senior Brother, the result would obviously be obvious. He used his own power to test whether the Fourth Senior Brother was still the same. From a certain point of view, the Tao Master's disciple had really done his best for the Fourth Senior Brother. However, the development of the matter surprised the many disciples of the Tao Masters, because neither of the two situations occurred. The world cluster was simply like a natural world cluster. No matter how the invisible figure condensed by the power of the world cluster crashed into it, there was no resistance to stop it from moving forward. In the end, the invisible giant had already crossed the endless void and directly arrived at the core of the world cluster. He saw the Fourth Senior Brother who was supposed to control everything there. At this moment, the Fourth Senior Brother was already lying on his back in the void. His eyes were closed and his breathing was even. He looked like an ordinary person who had fallen into the deepest sleep. Obviously, he had already lost consciousness. In the face of such a situation, the expression of the Tao Master's disciple suddenly changed. There was a kind of inexplicable horror in his eyes, and he said, "The Fourth Senior Brother has passed out." Hearing this, the expressions of the other disciples of the Tao Masters changed greatly. Passing out was just a trivial matter for ordinary creatures. It was fine as long as they could wake up again. But for cultivators, even those who had just stepped onto the path of cultivation, it was definitely a huge matter, because passing out meant that his mind was no longer in control of his body. In other words, there was a major problem with his mind. Even ordinary cultivators who had just entered the Tao were in such a state, let alone the Fourth Senior Brother who had already cultivated to the level of a fourth tribulation expert. He was billions and trillions of times more powerful than ordinary cultivators. It was self-evident how big the problem was for his mind to have a problem that could affect his control of his body. It could be said that if someone told them that the Fourth Senior Brother's body and mind had completely collapsed, they would at most wonder why this situation happened, but they would never doubt that the current situation was not caused by this reason. After the disciple of the Tao Master, who sent his power to condense into an invisible giant and entered the world cluster of the Fourth Senior Brother's world cluster, he did not hesitate at all. He directly followed the path of his power and rushed into the world cluster of the Fourth Senior Brother in the depths of the world cluster of the world cluster. Soon, his real body had already arrived at this location, and he personally saw the fourth senior brother lying in the void in a coma. There's no aura, and the power in his body is still smooth and calm. At least this kind of coma is not caused by some kind of cognitive confusion in the mind. After a slight sensing, the disciple had already made a judgment. At this moment, dozens of disciples of the Tao Master had already appeared by his side one after another. "How is it?" one of the Tao Master's disciples asked. These people who came at this time were obviously the disciples of the Tao Master who had a close relationship with the fourth senior brother. "I can't sense anything. You guys come and have a look." The disciple who came in first frowned and said. The others also frowned at this moment and began to carefully sense the situation of the fourth senior brother at this moment. However, although the strength of the few of them was not high, and each of them was good at different things, in terms of perception, there was not much difference. The disciple who first investigated the fourth senior brother didn't sense anything, and the others naturally didn't gain much. Soon, they were already at their wits' end and didn't know what to do. If it was an ordinary cultivator, they would naturally have moved the fourth senior brother to a more suitable position to investigate his situation. However, it was a pity that the person in front of them was the fourth senior brother, and this was the fourth senior brother's world cluster. This made them not dare to move the fourth senior brother at all before they figured out the situation of the fourth senior brother. This was not only because they were worried that they would be attacked by the world cluster, but also because moving the fourth senior brother away might cause a situation to worsen greatly. One after another, more and more disciples of the Tao Masters who were worried about the situation here entered the world cluster and came to the crowd's side. When there were more people, all kinds of relationships naturally became complicated. Among them, there were many who were not close to the fourth senior brother, and they were not even close. However, many of the cultivators who had entered this place were close to them. They could ignore the fourth senior brother, but they couldn't ignore some of the cultivators who came before them. This formed a snowball-like effect, causing the number of disciples of the Tao Masters to unknowingly increase to the scale of millions. Once the number of disciples of the Tao Masters increased, there would naturally be a qualitative change in the interweaving of various abilities. Unknowingly, the disciples of the Tao Masters communicated with each other and finally found a way to determine the fourth senior brother's current situation. This method was none other than the divine ability that they had refined together to enter the fourth senior brother's mind. Through this divine ability, they could send someone into the fourth senior brother's mind to find out what exactly was wrong with his mind. After some discussion, the cultivator who was the closest to the fourth senior brother finally won the right to enter the fourth senior brother's mind. Since they had decided on various measures, they naturally did not hesitate anymore. The disciples of the Tao Masters began to follow the results of the original discussion. Some provided inspiration, some provided power, some provided divine abilities, some provided arcane treasures, some provided living beings, some provided heaven and earth, some provided worlds, and some provided space-time. After almost gathering the power of millions of disciples, they finally refined the divine ability together after a few days. This divine ability contained the means of many disciples of the Tao Masters. Although it was only a divine ability, it seemed extremely magical and condensed. After it appeared in the void, it had naturally produced all kinds of indescribable changes and produced all kinds of subtle and unpredictable fluctuations, which constantly spread in all directions. It even caused many distant heavens and earth, worlds, and space-time to produce all kinds of inexplicable responses and produce all kinds of subtle changes. As for the disciples of the Tao Masters who were closer to the divine ability, those who participated in the refining were also the masters of this divine ability, so they were not affected by it. However, those disciples of the Tao Masters who did not have any means to use this divine ability, that was, they did not participate in the refining of the divine ability. As they were enveloped by the inexplicable wave of energy emitted by the divine ability, they felt that their souls were beginning to open up to this divine ability, and all the secrets in their souls seemed to be flowing out of the gradually opening channel on their own. This change made them all frightened, and their eyes became alert as they looked at the divine ability. Fortunately, they were not the target of this divine ability, and now this divine ability was just releasing the power of the fluctuations naturally. Therefore, at this time, they only needed to struggle a little at this time to break free from the influence of the fluctuations on them, and their minds completely returned to normal. I have a hunch that this divine ability will succeed. A disciple of the Tao Master who had just broken free from the influence of the fluctuations of the divine ability said resolutely. The other disciples of the Tao Masters who were also affected by the divine ability nodded in agreement. The disciples of the Tao Masters who refined the divine ability looked at the disciples of the Tao Masters who had just been affected with an inexplicable look. This strange look made those cultivators know that they had seen through the reason why they said so, and they could not help but feel inexplicably bored. They immediately shut up and pretended that nothing had happened. The poor resistance of the disciples of the Tao Masters to this divine ability was just an interlude. At this time, the disciple of the Tao Master who was the closest to the fourth senior brother raised his hand and waved. The divine ability rushed straight towards him, and in the blink of an eye, it had already wrapped him in this divine ability. This divine ability looked like an indescribable ray of light. Although it was extremely condensed, its essence was still a type of light. Being wrapped by this divine ability, the disciple of the Tao Master felt as if his body was melting and gradually melted into the divine ability. This divine ability was extremely mysterious, and the time attribute had long been meaningless in front of it. After an unknown amount of time, the disciple finally felt that he and the divine ability had become one, and there was no difference between them. At this moment, he knew that the time had come. At this moment, he did not hesitate and directly used the method set when refining this divine ability. He activated this divine ability and rushed straight towards the fourth senior brother. In the blink of an eye, it had already completely sunk into his body and quickly rushed towards the depths of his mind. During this process, the fourth senior brother's body trembled slightly, and a kind of instinctive resistance appeared out of thin air. It began to surge towards the divine ability from all directions, trying its best to stop this divine ability from penetrating deeper. At the same time, the entire world group also reacted. A powerful repulsive force acted on all the creatures that did not belong to this world group, which was the disciples of the Tao Masters who had entered this world group. The disciples of the Tao Masters who could not react in time felt the surrounding light and shadow change, and in the blink of an eye, they had already returned to the outside of the world group. He seems to be several times stronger than before. At this moment, all the disciples of the Tao Masters who had suffered this repulsive force had the same thought, and their expressions became a little strange. Chapter 2292. The disciples of the Tao Masters here were expelled from the world group by fourth senior brother. On the other side, the disciple of the Tao Master who was closest to fourth senior brother had penetrated the infinite obstacles with a divine sense refined by everyone and arrived at a vast and surging strange place. This place seemed to be a universe, a starry sky, a strange world with sky and earth, but it also seemed to be a strange and indescribable light and shadow. At first glance, it seemed to be everything, but at the same time, it seemed to be nothing. It seemed that he could find everything within the scope of his understanding, but at the same time, it seemed to be nothing, as if everything he knew did not exist here. This was very similar to the state of chaos, but the performance was completely different, which surprised and enlightened the Tao Master's disciple. He was surprised that the fourth senior brother's mind could turn into a state that he could not understand at all. After all, this was the mind, which represented all his will, all his thoughts, and the source of all his thoughts. It was normal for such a place to be strange and unpredictable, but to be chaotic to an incomprehensible level was obviously beyond the limit, and it was even simpler to understand. With such a mind, and the fourth senior brother's current performance, it was only natural that his world group would have such a change now. This thought flashed through the Tao Master's disciple's mind, but he did not dare to be careless. He tried his best to stimulate the power of the divine ability he had fused with, and tried his best to expel the chaotic and unpredictable and extremely strange mind waves around him. He tried his best to drill into the depths of his mind, where there was a subtle connection with the divine ability. This divine ability was specially condensed for the fourth senior brother, so it would naturally have a subtle connection with the core of the divine ability. At this time, even if his mind was so chaotic, it could still find the real key in the endless chaos. The relationship between the mind and the divine soul, the origin of life, and the essence of life was extremely subtle. It could be said that the two actually existed on different levels. The origin of life and the essence of life were existences like the divine soul. And the divine soul was an unfathomable place in the body of a living being. Such a place was extremely difficult to find, and if one did not have the corresponding realm, it was impossible to find it at all. However, no matter how difficult it was to find, it indeed existed in the body of a living being. It could be said that it was a relatively strange organ. In comparison, the mind was different. The mind was actually an abstract product. It was the past, present, and future thoughts, mental activities, thoughts, willpower, and everything else that represented the life's reaction to the self, and everything that wasn't it. From a purely material point of view, this kind of assemblage did not exist. It could be said that for the internal system of life, the soul, and everything within it was the plane of reality. The mind, on the other hand, was an abstract level. Of course, this was only a rough analogy. The relationship between the two was much more subtle and mysterious. It was also because of this that the Tao Master's disciple and the divine power had entered the fourth senior brother's mind. It was not like the kind where one would first enter the divine soul before going deep into the origin of life to regenerate the essence of life. In fact, it was precisely because his mind existed in such a state that the disciples of the Tao Masters needed to refine divine abilities to communicate with his mind and find his problems. If it wasn't for such a structure, with the means of the Tao Masters, as long as it was in the fourth senior brother's body, they would definitely be able to detect it, no matter how deeply it was hidden. In the turbulent sea of the soul, the Tao Master's divine power and the Tao Master's divine power kept drilling into the depths of the soul. With every step it took, the divine power would be attacked billions of times, and it would be damaged again and again at every moment. Even if the Tao Master's disciple looked at it from afar, he would still feel terrified. He felt as if he had turned into an ordinary person and was sailing a small boat on an extremely violent sea. He felt as if the boat could capsize at any time, and he would die a violent death. Fortunately, he had the divine ability refined by the disciples of the Tao sovereigns to protect him. If it wasn't for the divine ability blocking the endless spirit ripple from the outside world, he would have been devoured by the spirit ripples by now. If it was the waves of the mind of an ordinary living being, the Tao Master's disciple wouldn't care even if it swallowed him. After all, with his means and divine power, the waves of ordinary living beings wouldn't be a threat to him at all. He didn't even need to do anything. Just his existence alone was enough to suppress everything and allow him to easily transcend. However, it was obvious that the waves of the mind outside were not the waves of ordinary living beings. They were the fourth senior brother's mind waves. Moreover, the waves of the mind were not the ordinary kind that the Tao Master's disciple could understand. Instead, they were completely incomprehensible and unimaginable to the fourth senior brother. Under such circumstances, if he was swallowed by it, the result would be that his mind would be assimilated by the countless waves of the mind and turn into a state that he could not understand at that time. His fate would probably not be any better than the fourth senior brother's current fate. If his luck was a little worse, and the degree of assimilation was a little higher, perhaps even his own body, his own divine ability, his own might, his own power, and everything else would also be turned into a part of the mind wave. His own existence would be directly erased, and the result would definitely be crueler than death. In the infinite waves of the mind, the Tao Master's disciple's perception of time had unknowingly been distorted. Unknowingly, he felt that he had been moving forward in the invasion of the waves of the mind for more than 1 trillion years. However, there were still endless waves of the mind around him. Apart from the divine power that had been mostly worn away, everything else was no different from the beginning. Is the fourth senior brother's mind so vast? Suddenly, such a thought flashed through the Tao Master's disciple's mind. The Tao Master's disciple was extremely close to the fourth senior brother, and his understanding of the fourth senior brother was also far greater than that of the other Tao Master's disciples. Under such circumstances, although he had not personally seen the fourth senior brother's mind, he had a rough and accurate guess about the scale of the fourth senior brother's mind. And the scale of the waves of the mind he had experienced in front of him had far exceeded the fourth senior brother's mind in his impression. He had originally thought that only the disciples of the Tao Master, whose level was 2 or 3 levels higher than theirs, could have such a scale. At this time, the essence of the fourth senior brother's mind, which was connected to the divine power, was still faintly discernible. Although there was a difference from the beginning, it was not so big that the Tao Master's disciple could not even measure how long it would take for him to reach the essence of the mind through the extent of the change. Should I go back? This idea came to the mind of the Tao Master's disciple at this time. Although he was close to the fourth senior brother and was willing to take risks to save the fourth senior brother, but this did not mean that he was willing to die with the fourth senior brother. The current situation was that the fourth senior brother's mind waves were too vast, and he had no confidence to find the core of the mind before the divine power was completely worn out. In contrast, if he turned away from the waves at this time, according to the way he had come, he should have a chance to rush out of the mind waves and escape. Well, senior brother, it's not that I didn't try my best. It's just that this divine sense can't support me. When I go back, I will go back and gather many brothers and sisters to refine a stronger divine sense to rescue you. In the end, the Tao Master's disciple could not make up his mind. He could only sigh and give an excuse. Then he twisted the divine sense, changed the direction, and quickly rushed back to the way he came. As he moved forward, his face changed dramatically, because he suddenly felt that the impact he suffered from going out was more than 10 times stronger than the impact he suffered from going into the depths of the mind waves. Although the wear and tear of the divine sense was not 10 times stronger than the original, it was at least 7 or 8 times stronger. Oh no! For a moment, the Tao Master's disciple felt as if he had been struck by a bolt from the blue. If it was the same impact, there was still some hope for him to escape. But this time, the consumption had increased by 10 times. Unless the divine sense attached to him was 5 or 6 times stronger than before, there was no hope for him to escape. Feeling the terrifying consumption, the Tao Master's disciple could only stop moving. His expression kept changing in the divine sense. For a while, he could only sigh and change direction again. He followed the connection between the core of the mind and the divine sense, and moved back to the original direction. If he retreated, he would definitely die. If he moved forward, there was a slim chance that he could find the core of the fourth senior brother's mind before the divine sense was exhausted. The choice was already very obvious. There was no way back, so the Tao Master's disciple used even more strength to activate the divine sense. The speed at which the divine sense moved forward was several times faster than before. In this way, the Tao Master's disciple did not know how many billions of years had passed. The divine ability had been worn down to the point that there were only a few faint traces left in the surroundings. The surroundings were still filled with boundless spiritual waves, and it didn't look any different from before. An indescribable despair emerged in the heart of the Tao Master's disciple. I didn't expect that in the end. I still couldn't grasp that little bit of hope. In the end, with such a sigh, the last trace of the divine sense completely collapsed. The endless mind waves instantly drowned the Tao Master's disciple. As the endless soul waves covered his body, the disciple of the Tao Master felt the light and shadow around him change infinitely. He seemed to be suddenly divided into countless pieces and thrown into countless strange worlds, experiencing all kinds of strange experiences that he was either familiar with or unfamiliar with, familiar mixed with unfamiliar, or unfamiliar mixed with familiar. However, What was different from what he imagined was that he was not deceived during the process. That was to say, he could clearly feel his own existence, and he could clearly feel everything that every piece of him was experiencing. "What is this?" he murmured. All kinds of speculations flashed through his mind, but he quickly dispelled all these speculations. Nothing he understood could explain this strange experience at this moment. However, since the strange experience in front of him was not enough to make him encounter the terrifying danger he had expected, he naturally was not in a hurry to escape. His countless fragments wandered in the countless strange worlds and scenes, observing the situation of the fragments and experiencing the deep secrets behind the various strange things. At the level of the mind inside the human body, the existence of time did not have any meaning at all. Just like what the Tao Master's disciple felt before, he had been wandering in the endless mind waves for billions of trillions of years. But in fact, perhaps only a few breaths had passed in the outside world, or perhaps it really was billions of trillions of years. Before leaving the mind level, no one knew how much time had really passed in the outside world. Although these strange worlds behaved completely different from the mind waves, they also belonged to the mind level. Therefore, for this infinite world, time also did not have any meaning. Countless fragments continued to wander in the endless world, studying and comprehending. In the feeling of the Tao Master's disciple, time gradually passed. Unknowingly, trillions of years had passed. Even if an ordinary person faced a strange and profound world, after spending so much time, his understanding of the world would inevitably be profound enough to see some of the truth of the world. What's more, facing countless worlds, it was not an ordinary person, but a Tao Master's disciple who relied on his own strength to constantly climb to the fourth level of the Tao Master's path and become a four-tribulation expert. Through the long years of research, he finally discovered the truth of these countless worlds. These are the core of your mind, senior brother. But why does he exist in every world? At this time, in the countless worlds, the Tao Master's disciple looked with an indescribable look at the figure hidden in the deepest depths of each world, enveloping the entire world in an unimaginably obscure manner. It was a figure that the Tao Master's disciple was very familiar with, but he never thought he would see in the mind level of the fourth senior brother. Luo Fan. Chapter 2293. How could it be him? A look of astonishment appeared on the Tao Master's face. He would not be so surprised if he saw anyone in the fourth senior brother's mind. Even if he saw a true Saint Tao Master, he would at most be curious about the reason. However, Luo Fan, who had appeared in front of him, had completely subverted his ability to understand. After all, Luo Fan was their enemy no matter what. For the fourth senior brother, he could be said to be the biggest enemy. If it were not for him, the fourth senior brother would still be the fourth senior brother, the supreme existence who controlled the entire realm of the Tao Master. The entire fourth level of the Tao Master's road was still in the original state of order. Even the invasion of the four-eyed creature from before might not happen. Under such circumstances, in the depths of the fourth senior brother's mind, in the deepest part of every strange world, how could the Tao Master's disciple not be astonished? Could it be that they have developed feelings for each other? This thought appeared out of nowhere in the mind of the Tao Master's disciple. It was not that he was too dirty, but the situation in front of him was too similar to the situation where two enemies gradually developed feelings for each other after hurting each other. Of course, this ridiculous thought only existed in his mind for a moment, and he had already destroyed it. After all, he was the Tao Master's disciple, and his understanding of the fourth senior brother was the best among all the cultivators in the fourth level. Naturally, he knew that this kind of thing would never happen to the fourth senior brother. What is it? With this thought in mind, the fragments in the strange world began to move toward the figure, using various methods to test the nature of the figure. The figure was extremely strange, suspended in the deepest part of the world, in a strange state that seemed to exist but not exist at the same time. It seemed to have been connected with everything in this world, as if it was an abstract condensation of the essence of everything in this world. This appearance was more like an existence similar to the origin of the rules, rather than a complete creature that the Tao Master had seen. The figure did not respond to the Tao Master's various probing methods. It was as if it was not a living thing. It just sat there quietly, faintly discernible. It seemed to encompass everything, but it also seemed to contain an endless void. Nothing existed in it. The Tao Master's disciple was even more shocked when he gradually figured out the nature of the figure. Although this kind of essence had completely ruled out the ridiculous possibility that he had guessed before, it also proved one thing. That was, Luo Fan's existence had left a greater shadow in the fourth senior brother's heart than any of the disciples of the Tao Masters could imagine. Of course, there might be another possibility. That was Luo Fan, the rogue cultivator who caused all the twists and turns in the fourth layer, was stronger and more brilliant than they had expected. The reason why there were such changes in the depths of the fourth senior brother's mind was that the fourth senior brother's sensing ability and observation ability were sharper than theirs. His understanding of Luo Fan was clearer than theirs, and he knew more about the truth than theirs as a disciple of the Tao Master. The fourth senior brother, who had now turned into countless fragments to explore the various worlds, instinctively rejected the second possibility. Even after experiencing endless twists and turns and suffering countless setbacks, he still retained the pride of being a disciple of the Tao Master. If he admitted the second possibility, didn't it mean that the rogue cultivator's strength and brilliance had suppressed the impression left by the Tao Master in the fourth senior brother's heart, and even become the embodiment of some extremely brilliant core change? This was simply subverting the psychological advantage of being a disciple of the Tao Master and subverting the source of their pride. How would he be willing to admit this? Where is the fourth senior brother? After using all kinds of methods to investigate the figure, the disciple of the Tao Master began to turn his attention to the initial goal of entering the soul billows. After the figure of Luo Fan appeared in the depths of these strange worlds, the Tao Master's disciple already knew that his understanding of the mind waves was probably wrong. The countless worlds in the mind waves were probably not the manifestation of various kinds of mental chaos, but a manifestation of an intermediate state in which the mind was being rebuilt and reshaped. In this way, as the main body of the mind and the core of the mind, the fourth senior brother obviously needed to be scattered in these countless worlds and change with the changes in these worlds. That was to say, at this moment, in the countless strange worlds where his countless fragments were located, there should be a part of the fourth senior brother in each world. But at this time, he still did not feel any trace of the fourth senior brother in these worlds. This situation naturally made the Tao Master's disciple understand that his exploration of these worlds was still not deep enough. With this understanding, he calmed his mind and began to continue to explore the depths of those worlds. The direction of this depth was none other than the figure of Luo Fan in the depths of those worlds. Although he was unwilling to admit that Luo Fan's strength and subtlety had suppressed the fourth senior brother's impression of the Tao Master, he clearly knew that in any case, the existence of Luo Fan must be of great significance to the fourth senior brother. In this case, the most likely place for the fourth senior brother's fragments to be hidden was naturally the figure of Luo Fan in the depths of these strange worlds at this moment. Those figures seemed to be just ordinary figures from the outside. But as long as one went deep inside, one would find that the internal structure was extremely complicated. Layers of strange space-time were distributed in the figure in an even stranger way, forming a space-time structure that was hard to understand. But anyone could feel its mysteriousness and unfathomable. These structures were so mysterious that just by looking at them, the Tao Master's disciple had a feeling that his impression of the level of mystery could be subverted. Time was meaningless in this kind of spiritual waves. For the current Tao Master's disciple, he had plenty of time. Even if the internal structure of the figure of Luo Fan in these countless strange worlds was unimaginably complex and mysterious, he still did not feel discouraged and explored the space-time one by one. The amount of time it would take would be enough to make any ordinary cultivator feel despair. But for the Tao Master's disciple, it was just a repetitive process that was not difficult at all. In this process of exploration, without the slightest discouragement or irritation, the Tao Master's disciple felt that countless billions of trillions of years had passed. It even felt that the time he had experienced from the beginning of cultivation to the present did not seem to be as long as the time he had experienced in these spiritual waves. After such a long time of exploration, he finally found something. In the internal space-time structure of the figure, the countless fragments that belonged to the Tao Master's disciple almost at the same time found a very obscure and extremely mysterious space-time existence. This space-time was like a key node in the countless mysterious and strange space-time structures. It seemed to be involved in all the changes and actions of the entire complex and mysterious space-time structure. In general, it was involved in all the changes in the entire world, all the mysterious circulation and changes. If the fourth senior brother really existed in this figure, then the most likely place to exist was this space-time. After discovering this, the countless fragments of the Tao Master's disciple began to rush toward the space-time. There might be a difference in difficulty between advancing toward a certain goal and searching for a certain goal without a head or brain. Advancing towards a goal might encounter resistance that was countless times stronger than searching for a certain goal. However, in terms of the degree of difficulty, there is a world of difference between moving toward the goal and exploring the goal. In these countless complicated space-times, it took him billions of trillions of years to determine the uniqueness of this space-time. However, it only took him tens of thousands of years to really break into that space-time through the countless obstacles of the space-time. The time difference between the two was like the difference between heaven and earth. After spending tens of thousands of years to break into that space-time, the Tao Master's disciple had an inexplicable look of shock on his face. In this space-time, he saw a strange sea. It was a strange sea of colorful lights and shadows, and there were countless trillions of changes appearing in it at all times. This is the essence of the mind. At this moment, he had already made a judgment in his heart. The essence of the mind could be in any form. It could be in the form of a human, an animal, a divine beast, a magical beast, a demonic beast, or a strange beast. It could also be in the form of a variety of dead things, magic treasures, heaven and earth. It all depended on the characteristics of the owner of the mind. In fact, it was not the first time for him to see such an ocean-like essence of the mind in front of him. Therefore, at this moment, through the various performances of the sea and the various characteristics of the essence of the mind, he had already determined his essence. He knew that he was the essence of the mind, the core, and the most fundamental existence of the fourth senior brother at the level of the mind. In other words, he was one of the billions of trillions of this core and the most fundamental existence. After all, in the billions of strange worlds, there existed such a space-time and such essence of the mind. In this sea, which was the essence of the mind, light and shadow flowed and changed. From it, one could faintly see endless strange images, showing countless terrifying changes that were more turbulent than the waves of the mind seen from the outside. At this moment, the sea and the countless space-time set off countless huge waves, directly rushing toward the fragments of the Tao Master's disciple. The Tao Master's disciple was shocked, and the countless fragments wanted to avoid it. However, he found that he could no longer feel the infinite energy and power that had been perfectly integrated with his body and mind at this moment. He seemed to have turned from a fourth tribulation powerhouse into an ordinary person who had not yet entered the Tao. Moreover, he was an ordinary person with extremely poor talent, even much worse than the average level of ordinary people. This difference weakened his ability to avoid the surrounding waves to the point that it was almost non-existent. In the blink of an eye, the countless fragments were directly hit by the waves, and as they were swept away, they disappeared into the depths of the boundless sea like clay oxen entering the sea. At the last moment, a roar of shock and anger broke out from the countless fragments of the Tao Master's disciple, and then there was no more sound. The space-time returned to its original state. If there was anything different, it would be that the ocean inside the space-time seemed to be moving faster than before, and the light and shadows within seemed to be flowing faster and more nimble. After an unknown amount of time, perhaps hundreds of millions of years, or perhaps just a few short breaths, streams of light continued to shoot out from the countless fragments of the sea and began to condense and outline. Finally, one after another, they outlined a figure above the sea, a figure that looked exactly like the previous Tao Master's disciple. After this figure condensed, his eyes were blank, and his expression was dull. His body trembled unconsciously, as if he was just a living dead. Looking at this figure, it was the fragment of the Tao Master's disciple that had turned into an ordinary person and was swept into the depths of the sea by the waves. How could this be? After a long time, the figure's expression shook, and a bit of vitality began to return to his eyes. Then he began to murmur, and the vitality that appeared in his eyes gradually turned into a kind of disbelief. It was a kind of disbelief, as if his worldview had been overturned. In this disbelief, his body began to disintegrate, turned into a stream of light, and gradually dispersed. However, this stream of light did not completely collapse at this time, as when it first appeared. Instead, it formed a light ball and began to constantly flow and conflict within a radius of several tens of feet, as if countless streams of light wanted to condense, but could not condense no matter how hard they tried. Why, my past, will there be changes? Occasionally, such thoughts leaked out from the stream of light, shaking the surrounding space-time and even the boundless sea that existed below, the essence of the fourth senior brother's mind. After an unknown amount of time, perhaps hundreds of millions of years, or perhaps only a few days. Chapter 2294. At the same time, outside of fourth senior brother's body, in another place on the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, a drastic change that affected all areas of the entire group of worlds suddenly started. In the blink of an eye, it affected the entire group of worlds, causing it to tremble continuously. This change was immediately noticed by the cultivators who had been observing the world group to guess the state of the Tao Master's disciple and what had happened to fourth senior brother. What's going on? What's happening to fourth senior brother's body? The Tao Master's disciples were secretly horrified. One by one, they rushed toward the world group from all directions, and in the blink of an eye, they gathered around the world group and looked at it in disbelief. At this time, the entire world cluster suddenly began to collapse from an unknown place. It was as if the world cluster itself could not withstand the subtle tremors that were appearing in various parts of the world cluster. Damn it! The expressions of the cultivators who were close to the Tao Master's disciple changed drastically. If it was just an ordinary tremor, it would be worth worrying about, but it was ultimately a change that did not affect the foundation. Even if they were worried, they would still feel at ease and feel that the change would not endanger the Tao Master's disciple's life. However, now that the entire world group had completely collapsed, they could not treat it with the same attitude as before. The importance of the world group had been emphasized countless times. It could even be said that it wasn't just connected to the living being's current life, it was even connected to all of the living being's past cultivation and all of its experiences. It could be said that any change that happened, no matter how subtle, would have an unimaginable impact. Moreover, this complete collapse seemed to be a change that was about to be completely destroyed. Help me think of something. The Tao Master's disciple, who was closest to the Tao Master's disciple, roared. Looking at his anxious expression, it seemed like he could not wait to rush into the world group to stop it from collapsing. Of course, this was just an impulse. Under the support of his rationality, he knew in the end that such a method was meaningless. Rushing in would only put himself in danger. Maybe there's something wrong with fourth senior brother, one of the Tao Masters said at that moment. Hearing this, everyone was slightly shocked. This was a conclusion that could be easily deduced. In this kind of situation where everyone was anxious, if no one said it, it would take a long time for them to come to their senses. In an instant, many disciples of the Tao Masters turned and headed towards the fourth senior brother's world group. Some of the more anxious disciples of the Tao Masters even rushed into the cluster of worlds, wanting to go to where the fourth senior brother's main body was and see with their own eyes the changes that might have happened to him. Countless trillions of years had passed in the fourth senior brother's mind. However, to the outside world, it had only been over 100 years since the Tao Master's disciple had entered the fourth senior brother's mind with the help of the divine sense. Although it was a long time for a cultivator's mind to change, it was just a blink of an eye for the many rogue cultivators under the Tao Master's tutelage. It was precisely because of this that none of the Tao Master's disciples were worried that there would be irreversible changes if the situation dragged on for too long. At this moment, the Tao Master's world group that had entered the fourth senior brother's mind had changed once again. The collapsed Tao Master's world group began to frantically absorb endless creation energy from the surroundings under the effect of some indescribable mystery. It began to regenerate space-time, worlds, and lands in just a few dozen breaths. The Tao Master's world group had already formed a prototype. This change caused many of the cultivators who were still guarding this place to be surprised. A series of voice transmissions were transmitted to the disciples of the Tao Masters who had just left and were heading towards the fourth senior brother's location to find out what had happened here. In an instant, a series of questions came from everywhere. What's going on? Why is he suddenly fine? He's fine. At the very least, his life should be saved. The Tao Master's disciples who were guarding there fell into hesitation. What's the problem? What do you mean by his life is saved? The others were clearly not satisfied with such an answer. This clearly meant that although the Tao Master's world group had reformed, there should have been some kind of incomprehensible change that might even have a great impact on the Tao Master's world group. Hearing this, the Tao Master's disciples didn't know how to explain. In the end, they could only ask their companions who wanted to understand the changes to return and see the changes with their own eyes. Following this suggestion, the Tao Master's disciples began to return. It didn't take long for them to gather around the Tao Master's world group and return to their original state. However, their worries had lessened greatly this time, but their bewilderment had increased by an unknown amount. The reason for that was because during the time they returned, the world group had already finished condensing, or rather, it could be said that it had finished evolving. In the end, the changes that the other Tao Master's disciples couldn't describe had truly appeared in front of them. The Tao Master's disciples who left without hesitation to go directly to where fourth senior brother was to investigate the changes, there were people who had a deeper relationship with the owner of the Tao Master's world group. Therefore, they were naturally more familiar with the Tao Master's world group than the others. The changes that others couldn't determine at a glance were discovered by them at a glance. His Tao Master's world group has also changed, just like fourth senior brother's Tao Master's world group. They were all shocked, and their eyes were filled with bewilderment. In their eyes, the Tao Master's world group that had just collapsed and reformed gave them a feeling as if they were looking at fourth senior brother's world group. Has he been assimilated? At this moment, such a guess appeared in the minds of the Tao Master's disciples. They didn't know what caused the complete change in the Tao Master's world group. However, they knew that the cause of all this must be because something that happened to fourth senior brother had also happened to the Tao Master's disciples. And this kind of change from one individual to another was obviously a kind of assimilation process at this moment. If they really disregarded everything, they should start refining the divine ability again and send someone into fourth senior brother's mind to investigate what exactly happened. However, it was obvious that after what had happened to the Tao Master's disciple, no one else was willing to propose this method. Even the cultivators who had the closest relationship with Tao Master's disciples were unwilling to use this method to investigate the truth. After all, this kind of sudden change was too strange. They had no idea how serious the consequences of this change would be. Perhaps it would directly sever their paths towards the Tao. Under such circumstances, no matter how close they were, they would definitely not take risks easily. With this tacit understanding, the many Tao Master's disciples gathered outside the world group and began to investigate the various changes in the world group. They wanted to find out the impact of this change and even understand the source of this change. Because this change was of the same origin as the change in fourth senior brother's world group, and could even be said to be almost the same, they did not let go of four senior brothers world group. Almost every one of them tried to understand the changes in the two world groups at the same time. They wanted to fully understand the various details of the two world groups and find the source of the changes in the two world groups. Just like that, time passed by slowly. Unknowingly, another few hundred years had passed. On this day, suddenly, a Tao master's disciples had a flash of inspiration and finally found the truth that they should have discovered long ago, but had not discovered until now. I understand all the heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time related to Tao masters have undergone earth-shaking changes, he exclaimed. His sharp voice directly shocked the many Tao masters' disciples who were observing the changes in the world group with him, and they were awakened from their respective comprehension. When they were awakened, they did not have the time to express their dissatisfaction towards the Tao master's disciple for waking them up. They could not help but start to observe according to the person's words. As soon as they did so, their expressions changed drastically, because they realized that what he said couldn't be any more correct. The identity of these Tao master's disciples was almost the same as the owner of the world group in front of them. This identity caused them to have more or less intersections with the owner of the world group in the past. Therefore, they could more or less know that some of the worlds in front of them were related to Tao masters. Some were created by comprehending Tao masters' techniques. Some were created by studying Tao masters' inheritances. Some were created by experimenting in front of Tao masters. And some were even created by using the true meaning in Tao masters' words to create heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time. Even if none of them could know everything, they would definitely know something more or less. Everything has changed. The disciples of the Tao masters came to a conclusion after observing the situation. After judging what they knew about heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time, they began to look for their conclusions from others. In the end, they found that everyone else's expression was similar to theirs. They were also sure that the heaven and earth, worlds, and space-time related to Tao masters had undergone great changes. Everyone could only be sure of one thing. As the number increased, the whole gathered naturally overlapped with the real whole. In other words, it was more likely to represent the real whole. For a moment, the Tao master's disciples were terrified. It was as if a gust of cold air was born in their bodies out of nowhere, causing their bodies to almost completely freeze. What on earth has happened to them? How could it cause such a change? Could it be that they have the guts to betray Tao masters? Similar thoughts emerged in the minds of the Tao masters' disciples. Once something was related to Tao masters, then no matter what incredible changes happened, it was a matter of course in the eyes of the Tao masters' disciples. Even though the change in the past, represented by the changes in the world clusters, was something that was almost impossible, it wasn't something to be surprised about anymore in their eyes. At this moment, they were more concerned about what had happened between them and Tao masters. Why did the power of Tao masters have such an effect? That was right. As of this moment, they had come to a conclusion that wasn't even a conclusion. It was the power of the Tao sovereign that had caused these inconceivable changes. The desire to find out the truth began to recede from the hearts of the Tao masters' disciples. An inexplicable vigilance and suspicion began to emerge in their eyes, which made them involuntarily change their minds when they looked at the world cluster of the fourth senior brother and the world cluster of the Tao master's disciples in front of them. Originally, they seemed to be looking at a problem that needed to be solved urgently, but now it was like they were looking at a plague that they had to avoid. The Tao master's disciples began to retreat one after another. Not long after, only a few hundred cultivators who had a close relationship with the fourth senior brother or the Tao master's disciples remained to continue investigating. Of course, even they were no longer as determined to investigate as before. They would not stop until they reached their goal. On the contrary, they were a little hesitant. They faintly planned to stop if they found something wrong. They would never betray Tao masters. There must be a reason for this change. There must be. This was the belief in their hearts that supported their actions. Time passed quickly. In the blink of an eye, another few hundred years had passed. On this day, a cultivator finally could not help but say to the other Tao Master's disciples who had not retreated, "Perhaps we are looking in the wrong direction. Perhaps they had originally stayed and gathered here because of their friendship with the Tao Master's disciples or the fourth senior brother. But after years of persistence, they had already unknowingly established a very deep friendship between them, and their understanding of each other had also unknowingly become extremely profound." Chapter 2295. Then why did the Tao Master's world group appear? Why did their attitude towards the Tao Master change so much that it was almost like betrayal? Wasn't it because he had invaded the fourth senior brother's mind and was assimilated by the fourth senior brother's mind, resulting in the same change as the fourth senior brother? Why did the fourth senior brother change like that? Wasn't it just because he had a conversation with the rogue cultivator that they couldn't hear at all? If one were to get to the bottom of it, wasn't the root cause of their change that the rogue cultivator, Luo Fan? This was what the Tao Master's disciples thought of at this time, a fact that had been ignored by them. When he thought of this, it was obvious what he should do. After all, these Tao Master's disciples were all intelligent beings. How could such simple reasoning be difficult for them? Let's go. As long as we know what he said to the fourth senior brother, we may know what is going on. A Tao Master's disciple said. The other Tao Master's disciples either showed determination or hesitation, but in the end, they nodded and agreed to this proposal. Immediately, many Tao Master's disciples turned into rays of light, pushed aside the power of creation, and headed in the direction of the Luo Fan world group. Their movements, however, attracted the attention of many cultivators. After all, at this time, in the fourth floor of the Tao Master's path, the most conspicuous thing was the change in the world group of the fourth senior brother and the Tao Master's disciples. Even if they had decided not to get involved in this matter that might involve the betrayal of the Tao Master, they still paid attention to the two world groups. Under such circumstances, the Tao Master's disciples who stayed behind actually headed in a certain direction. This was clearly a sign that they had found something. How could it not attract their attention? And those who were quick-witted instantly deduced the target they were looking for from the direction they were heading in. Then, thinking about it, they had already thought of what the Tao Master's disciples had thought about for a long time before. Their expressions changed greatly, and there was a faint feeling of eagerness in their hearts. As long as we find him, we'll be able to find out why they're acting so treacherously. This thought appeared in the minds of many cultivators. Due to the fact that the fourth senior brother and the Tao Master's disciple were suspected of betraying the Tao Master, they did not dare to directly get involved at this moment. They did not dare to pay more attention to the Tao Master's disciple and the fourth senior brother. However, this did not mean that they were not curious. Although curiosity wasn't the driving force behind all cultivators' growth, it was a very important support for most cultivators to reach their current level. At this time, the cause of a change that they could not understand had appeared in front of them. It seemed that as long as they participated in it, they would know the answer. How could the disciples of the Tao Masters at the fourth level of the Tao Master's path not be curious? None of the cultivators who could come to the fourth level were stupid. As the goals of these Tao Masters became clearer, more and more cultivators deduced their goals and reasons for doing so. Unknowingly, cultivators began to move from all directions, following the disciples of the Tao Masters towards the direction of Luo Fan's world group. Seeing that they had joined, none of the disciples of the Tao Masters who set off first were surprised, nor did they feel the slightest bit of surprise. In fact, the choice of those who joined later was not surprising at all. The disciples of the Tao Masters also had a deep understanding of the cultivators on the same level as them. They naturally knew the mentality of the cultivators and what choice they would make in this situation. Soon, hundreds of thousands of cultivators followed them to the outside of the world group of Luo Fan. When they arrived at Jihu, everyone fell silent. They looked at the world cluster from afar, at the layer of light that was like a living thing that covered the world cluster. All of them had suffered a great loss in this world group. Now that they were revisiting this place, they felt extremely complicated. Some of the cultivators' expressions even began to change according to their restless emotions. After a long while, a disciple of the Tao Masters sent a voice transmission. We asked Senior to tell us about the conversation between Senior and fourth Senior brother. At this level, there was no point in hiding anything. Small talk was completely unnecessary in most situations. Obviously, for Luo Fan, he didn't belong to any of the other small parts. At the very least, according to these cultivators' understanding of Luo Fan, he was clearly not the small group of people who needed small talk. Because of this, the disciple of the Tao Masters went straight to the point and told him what he wanted and what Yi Shiwen could provide. As for whether Luo Fan would listen to their request and tell them what they wanted, it was not up to them to decide. This voice transmission was directly transmitted into the light of heaven and earth that was like a living thing. It was even transmitted through the light of heaven and earth into the world group and into Luo Fan's heart. This was the lesson Luo Fan had learned from his previous experience. Even if he was wholeheartedly adjusting and comprehending the various mysteries of the world cluster, he still had to spare some attention to pay attention to the situation outside and receive information from the outside world. Otherwise, it would be shameful if he did not notice the invasion of another Tao Master's path. Hearing this voice transmission, Luo Fan woke up from the deep state of comprehension. With a slight movement in his heart, he understood everything that had happened outside during this period of time. For a moment, a faint smile appeared on his face. I didn't expect that such a simple reminder would have such an impact. Their way of cultivation is really closely related to true saints. At this moment, such a thought flashed in his mind. Compared to the other disciples of the Tao Masters or the rogue cultivators who were clueless about what had happened to the fourth senior brother and the disciples of the Tao Masters, Luo Fan's understanding of the world group, cultivation, and even true sage realm was much deeper than theirs. What he saw at this moment was much more than what they had seen. Therefore, he instantly knew the changes that had happened to the fourth senior brother and the disciple of the Tao Master. The immortality of a true sage was only the most superficial characteristic of a true sage. It was a characteristic that ordinary cultivators and living beings could understand. As for omnipotence, omniscience, and omniscience, it was just a rough description of the various incomprehensible means of the existence of true saints into a concept that ordinary cultivators could understand. If one were to study it in depth, the various means of the existence of true saints would be incomprehensible to any cultivator who had not yet become a saint. Under such circumstances, all the changes related to true saints would obviously be added with various changes that were incomprehensible to ordinary living beings. The more entangled with a true saint, the more incomprehensible changes there would be. In the eyes of ordinary cultivators, and even in the eyes of the Tao Masters, this was nothing. They would even regard it as a standard of measurement. In their eyes, the more profound and incomprehensible a technique was, the more ingenious and powerful it would be. From a certain point of view, this was not wrong. A true sage was a supreme existence, countless times more powerful than an ordinary cultivator. The more one was entangled with a true sage, the more ingenious and powerful it would be. However, this was only in the eyes of ordinary cultivators. For an existence like Luo Fan, who was determined to become a true saint, this change was definitely not a good thing. To entangle with a true saint was a burden to them. Moreover, it was a burden that they could not break free from or even bear. The more entangled they were, the more astonishing the burden would be. This was also the fundamental reason why he had brazenly condensed the divine light into the blade of wisdom to completely cut off everything he had comprehended from the shadow of a true saint, the brand, and all other existences related to a true saint. In fact, from that time on, everything that Luo Fan wanted to comprehend was no longer the same as before, where he only needed to grasp it. Instead, he had to exhaust all the mysteries and completely master all the principles within it, and then decompose it into the most important things related to his worldview. Otherwise, how could he transform any abstruse thing and phenomenon into concepts, worldviews, and even the mysteries related to concepts and divine abilities? At this moment, in his eyes. The changes that happened to the fourth senior brother and the disciple of the Tao Master were similar to when he used the blade of wisdom to cut off all the comprehensions related to a true saint. Of course, it was only similar. Compared to what he had done in the past, the current means of the two were not as decisive as his, and it was also because of this means that their understanding of their past had changed. And naturally, the change in understanding also caused the heaven and earth, the world, and the space-time that they had opened up in the past to look different. That was to say, in fact, their past only seemed to have changed. In fact, their past was still the same. And the fundamental reason why this seemingly different reason caused such a big reaction for many practitioners and even themselves, and even subverted their own minds, causing them to need to reshape their minds to be able to recover, was that the degree of the change had completely subverted their views of the world. It was to the extent that even the worldview that they had accumulated since they started cultivating and had yet to be completely sorted out had been overturned. In Luo Fan's eyes, the root cause of all this could not be more obvious. It was clearly what he had thought just now. The connection between their cultivation path and the true divine was too close, even to the extent that it had reached the point of being inseparable. However, this is also considered an opportunity for you guys. If you can recover, you'll definitely be more clear-headed, and perhaps your chances of becoming a true saint will be many times higher than before. He quickly thought of something, and his expression became even more inexplicable. At this moment, the cultivators outside had already started shouting for the third time. Seeing this, Luo Fan's heart jolted, and a shadow stepped out of his body. In a flash, it crossed countless Genesis energy and arrived outside the cluster of worlds, arriving in front of the hundreds of thousands of cultivators. Seeing Luo Fan's silhouette appear, the cultivators bowed one by one, showing their utmost respect. They were already completely convinced by Luo Fan's strength, and none of them dared to act presumptuously in front of him, even if they looked like they were here to question Luo Fan. Seeing their reaction, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "What I told the so-called fourth senior brother was very simple, but aren't you worried that you'll end up in the same situation as the two of them?" Hearing this, the cultivators' hearts trembled slightly. Originally, they were not sure that Luo Fan knew the reason for all these changes, but now that Luo Fan said it without hiding anything, they were sure that their original guess was right. The powerhouse of the independent cultivators in front of them actually knew what was going on. For a moment, the expressions of the cultivators changed. They did not dare to ignore Luo Fan's warning. However, their curiosity made them unwilling to give up on the chance to find out the truth. Those who dared to appear here were all mentally prepared for the situation of falling under the tutelage of the fourth senior brother and the Tao Sovereign, as Luo Fan had said. Therefore, although their expressions kept changing, in the end, not a single one of them chose to leave. Instead, their expressions gradually turned firm as they stood there and bowed to Luo Fan once again. Seeing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, "Well, since you want to know, I'll tell you. I only hope that you won't regret it." Needless to say, the most important thing I said to the so-called fourth senior brother was that I asked him a question. "What is it?" Many of the cultivators were secretly shocked. What exactly was the problem that caused this almost irreversible outcome? The question is, why? Many Tao masters tacitly approve of the war between different Tao masters and even encourage it. Luo Fan just smiled faintly. After that, he did not bother to pay attention to the cultivators, but turned around and returned to his own group of worlds and finally disappeared into his body. At this moment, the cultivators outside fell into a state of confusion. Chapter 2296. Whatever the fourth senior brother could think of, it was impossible that he was the only one who could think of it. Those disciples of the Tao Master had a similar growth trajectory as the fourth senior brother. Even if their final achievements were different, their way of thinking and their standpoint were all similar. Under such circumstances, what the fourth senior brother could think of, they could also think of after several twists and turns. Therefore, after a while, the expressions of some of the disciples of the Tao Master began to change. This was originally a very ordinary question, but the answer it pointed to caused their hearts to tremble. Could it be a game? A disciple of the Tao Master with the most agile mind murmured. His eyes constantly changed, and his aura began to produce all kinds of indescribable subtle changes. His words, like the morning bell and evening drum, made the expressions of the disciples of the Tao Master or the individual cultivators who were still thinking hard began to change greatly. After thinking about it, the only possibility that could explain it was a game. However, if the disciples of the Tao Master were interested in games and had the practice of playing games, then how much of what they had done before was a game? Then how much of what they had said to them in the past was just the background of the game? These thoughts that extended out caused all of their hearts to tremble, and they found it difficult to control themselves. It's impossible, a disciple of the Tao Master murmured. It was unknown whether he meant that the answer to the question at this moment could not be a game, or whether he meant that some of his interactions with the Tao Master in the past were the background of the game. In their hearts, the Tao Master was too unfathomable, and the entanglement between their way of cultivation and the Tao Master was too great. Under such circumstances, they continued to think along this line of thought, but the more they thought about it, the more panicked they became. The more they thought about it, the more they felt that everything they had known in the past seemed to contain all kinds of secrets that they had not discovered before. In the beginning, this kind of situation would only cause a change in their mood and would not cause too many other changes. However, along with the passage of time, as they traced deeper and deeper, when they finally reached a node that would decide their path of cultivation and their path of cultivation itself, the influence would instantly skyrocket by thousands of times. In the end, it would break through the limits of what was real and what was fake, and it would trigger a true change that was sufficient to make any one of them have a mental breakdown. Soon, among the countless world clusters scattered around the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, some of them began to collapse one after another. It seemed that the changes that had happened to the disciples of the Tao Master were also happening to the masters of the world clusters. The number of cultivators who experienced such changes continued to increase over time. During the process of the world clusters changing, more and more cultivators began to fall into a state of confusion. Outside of Luo Fan's world clusters, more and more cultivators fell into a state of confusion. Their bodies surged with great power of creation, constantly stirring up the endless power of creation around them, causing all kinds of strange and complicated changes. In the end, when the worlds they corresponded to entered the next phase of change and began to give birth to new worlds and dimensions, an indescribable suction force acted on their already dazed bodies out of nowhere, pulling them in an extremely mysterious manner and summoning them back to their own worlds, back to the depths of their own world cluster, to the core of their own world cluster. With the return of the masters of the world clusters, the evolution of the world clusters seemed to have become smoother and more determined. This change made the cultivators on the fourth level who had not yet come to participate in it feel both shocked and curious. Unconcealable panic kept surging in their hearts. What the hell is going on? Why is it like this just because I said something in the past? This was the doubt that emerged in the hearts of the cultivators, and it was also the source of their panic. They could not resist coming to Luo Fan's place to seek answers when they saw the changes in the world clusters of the fourth senior brother and the disciples of the Tao Master. Now that they saw that it would be so dangerous to ask, it was naturally even more impossible for them to do so. For a moment, they were like tortoises with their heads in their shells. They did not dare to approach, and they did not even dare to watch. No! Suddenly, a roar came from the mouth of one of the disciples of the Tao Master. Then, a sharp blade emerged from the top of his head and plunged straight into his body, disappearing without a trace. With the disappearance of the sharp blade, countless terrifying roars came from his body, and his body collapsed again and again in the roars, and then reformed again and again. Finally, after the final reunion, all the rumbling sounds disappeared, and his body returned to normal. It looked as if nothing had happened. If there was any difference between the current him and the previous him, it was that his eyes had become a little blank, as if he had completely forgotten that he had appeared here and everything that had happened to him before. The cultivators who were watching from afar were even more shocked when they saw this. They were experienced and knowledgeable, so they naturally knew that what the disciple of the Tao Master had done was nothing else but to cut off some of his memories with the sharp blade of his mind. For life, memory was the foundation of the self. Cutting off one's own memory was equivalent to cutting off a part of oneself. Compared with suicide, although there was a difference, it was not big. Under such circumstances, an expert who had grown to the fourth level of the path of a Tao Master, after hearing something, had no choice but to cut off the memory to avoid the possible bad luck that might be brought by it. What did he hear before that made him have no choice but to use such a method to avoid irreversible consequences? All kinds of shock and doubt made the courage of the cultivators who originally had some courage to observe the changes of the disciples of the Tao Master and the rogue cultivators dwindle, and they also joined the camp of the other cowards. I can't remember. Soon, the cultivator who had severed his own memories regained his composure. Muttering to himself, he turned and left. Although he had cut off his memory, he was still a disciple of the quick-witted Tao Master. In this way, he could naturally analyze that the person who had just cut off his memory was himself. From this, he could naturally analyze that the memory must be a kind of evil that must not be stained by him. Only in this way would he have no choice but to cut off his own memory to avoid serious consequences as a disciple of a Tao Master. He was naturally confident. After understanding that it was his own doing, he immediately believed in himself. In the process of constantly reminding himself not to analyze and not to recall, he walked towards his world group. Not long after, he went into his own world group and once again increased the size of the team of cowards. The action of the disciple of the Tao Master seemed to have inspired other disciples of the Tao Master who could still hold on, causing the number of cultivators to cut off their memory to continue to increase. Until a few days later, tens of thousands of cultivators chose to cut off their memory, completely cutting off the question they had heard from Luo Fan out of curiosity, along with the answer. They simply and decisively chose to leave this area and return to their own world group, intending to not come out for a long time. At this time, the remaining cultivators who did not cut off their memory no longer needed to and could not cut off their memory. That was because their world group had completely collapsed and reformed, completely different in appearance for a time. The entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path fell into an inexplicable state of dead silence. A state of dead silence where there was no other sound except the sound of the power of creation. Why bother? Luo Fan, who occasionally glanced at this change, sighed faintly at this time. He had previously asked those cultivators if they must know, and all of them expressed that they definitely wanted to know. Each of them was full of confidence, but in the end, after hearing it, so many of them chose to cut off their memory and completely erase their own words. This kind of inconsistent behavior was obviously not glorious. However, although your methods are decisive and resolute, can you really not know this kind of thing that you already know? Then, he sneered again and no longer cared about what they were doing. At this moment, cutting off one's memory was indeed very useful. It was enough to make those cultivators forget the question they had heard from Luo Fan, and it could also make them completely unaffected by the result of the deduction of that question. However, once a person learned to ride a bicycle, he would remember it for the rest of his life. After hearing such a far-reaching question, it had long been deeply engraved in the deepest part of their hearts. Even if they cut off their memory, it would not be able to completely erase it. Once the time was right in the future, when the opportunity was right, this kind of question would definitely resurface and be remembered by them again. In other words, they paid the price of their own thinking and memory damage to perform this method. But in the end, they would only be able to delay the changes that were currently happening to other cultivators. One day, they would still end up in this state after all. However, this obviously did not affect Luo Fan at all, and he would not pay any attention to them because of this. He could only bear the consequences of his own choices. At this moment, he was immersed in the interaction between the light of heaven and earth and the world group. He was comprehending the various mysterious and wonderful mysteries contained within, and he was experiencing the various subtle principles that were displayed during the process. The will of heaven and earth contained within the light of heaven and earth was truly on the same level as the will of heaven and earth in the outside world. Such an existence's control over the world, the control over the world, and the control over space-time was clearly not something that Luo Fan could compare to. During the process of control, the combined force that the countless worlds, and space-time could unleash was definitely countless times more powerful than when it was under Luo Fan's control. Moreover, the deeper mysteries of the world group that were revealed were definitely countless times more powerful than when it was under Luo Fan's control. As such, Luo Fan's gains from comprehending these things were much greater than when it was under his control. Not to mention anything else, just the power of the world group that he had condensed was already 100 times stronger than before. Whether it was the quantity or quality of the power of the world group, it was all the same. Apart from that, the mysteries of various concepts were constantly revealed in the operation of the world group and were continuously absorbed by Luo Fan to enrich and perfect his worldview. How could Luo Fan give up on such a cultivation that had so many benefits? Thousands of years passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, fourth senior brother's body suddenly trembled, and he opened his eyes that had been shut for a long time. As he opened his eyes, his world group began to tremble slightly, and all kinds of strange sounds came from the countless worlds, and space-time in the world group. It was as if the entire world group was welcoming and celebrating his awakening. "Thank you, junior brother." At this moment, fourth senior brother suddenly spoke. Then, with a wave of his hand, a figure materialized and appeared in front of him. It was the body of the Tao Master's disciple that had entered the depths of his heart. However, compared to before, the Tao Master's disciple seemed to have become much more dispirited, and he lay there quietly, like a vegetable. As he left fourth senior brother's heart, an indescribable suction force suddenly acted on him out of nowhere. Following this, his body gradually turned illusory and eventually disappeared without a trace, as if he had never been there. This was fourth senior brother's world group, so he naturally knew everything that had happened. At this moment, he only needed to take a slight glance to know that the Tao Master's disciple had been sucked into his world group. As such, he did not do anything to stop the suction force, and only quietly watched the Tao Master's disciple leave. After the Tao Master's disciple disappeared, fourth senior brother sighed and turned to look at his world group. "I didn't expect that I was just a pawn that was kept in the dark." After a long while, he mumbled with a bitter, helpless, and indescribable sense of relief on his face. With a wave of his hand, the endless power of the world group gathered on his body and enveloped him. Compared to the past, the power of these worlds was not much stronger before he underwent that kind of change. However, compared to before, fourth senior brother's understanding and control of the power had become many times more profound. In the past, although he could perfectly control this power, it was mostly through the use of various subtle techniques. Although he seemed to have completely understood this power, there were still profound mysteries that he couldn't hide or that he couldn't understand in the various techniques he used. Chapter 2297. The subversion and remodeling of one's mind was an extremely dangerous process. If one was not careful, one's mind would completely collapse, and one would become a walking corpse. However, this was also an opportunity. Once the remodeling was completed, there would definitely be an indescribable transformation compared to before, and one would obtain an unimaginable sublimation. Of course, there were also cultivators who felt that the greatest danger was the completion of the remodeling. That was because once one's mind was remodeled, one would become extremely different from before. The change that occurred in the depths of one's mind could be said to have turned one into a different person. In that case, could one still be considered as the original person after the remodeling? Compared to the original person, wasn't the remodeling equivalent to erasing the original person? Perhaps for many cultivators who severed their own lives to escape, the remodeling equivalent to completely erasing their current existence. However, all these risks were already in the past for the fourth senior brother, who had already completed the remodeling. Regardless of whether it was the risk of the remodeling process or whether he would still be himself after the remodeling, they were all meaningless to him now. After all, he had already gone through the risk of the remodeling process, so it was naturally meaningless. As for whether he would still be himself after the remodeling, there was no need to even mention the risk. Right now, he was already the original him after the remodeling, or the fourth senior brother who had his original self erased and remodeled. He was the only one left, so it was naturally meaningless. At this moment, there was only an indescribable, complex emotion in his heart. He felt an indescribable sense of gratitude towards Luo Fan who guided him to this point of view, but he also felt an indescribable displeasure. After all, although Luo Fan's words had ultimately brought him such great benefits, if he had not been careful, he would have become a walking corpse by now. Moreover, he was so indifferent to everything that he had experienced, treating everything as if it was nothing special. He didn't care what dangers he had encountered in the process, and he didn't care if he was still his original self. This made him even angrier. Let me see if you need to be remodeled. Such a thought flashed through his mind. The fourth senior brother's figure flickered, and in the blink of an eye, he was already out of his world group. At the same time, the endless power of the world cluster began to surge out from the world cluster. Like clouds and mist, it wrapped around his body and brought him across the barrier of an unknown amount of the power of creation in the blink of an eye. He arrived outside Luo Fan's world cluster and faced the light of heaven and earth that seemed to be a living thing. In the face of such light, the fourth senior brother once again felt an indescribable sense of insignificance. It was as if he had suddenly become an ant standing in front of a vast planet. The light of heaven and earth was not targeted at him, but just the wisps of aura that it released during its natural circulation were enough to make him feel an indescribable pressure. In fact, he could even faintly hear a rattling sound in his heart, as if he was about to collapse under this pressure. It's actually so terrifying. At that instant, the fourth senior brother thought to himself. It was not his first time seeing Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. In fact, he had even been closer to it in the past. However, in the past, although he could feel that the light of heaven and earth was extremely powerful, it was only vague and indistinct. It was as if there was some kind of mist between him and the light of heaven and earth, causing him to not have a direct sense of how terrifying the light of heaven and earth was. However, now that he saw the light of heaven and earth again, the mist that was originally blocking his view had completely disappeared. He finally felt the power of the light of heaven and earth with his own eyes. He could truly feel the terror brought about by this kind of power. All of a sudden, his determination to give Luo Fan a huge shock was shaken. However, the fourth senior brother was the fourth senior brother after all. After his heart was reconstructed, his mind was much more resolute than before. At this time, he still quickly extinguished all kinds of cowardly emotions in his heart, and his expression became firm again. You seem to have something to say to me. At this time, a voice came into his ears, causing his heart to tremble. This, of course, was the voice of Luo Fan. As mentioned before, because of the previous lesson, Luo Fan had been paying attention to everything that happened on the fourth level of the road to Down Master at all times. Under such circumstances, how could he not know that the fourth senior brother had come to him after his heart was reconstructed? At this time, seeing the fourth senior brother come to the outside of his world group with curiosity and malice, he became curious and planned to ask him what he wanted to do. As for keeping his identity and waiting for the fourth senior brother to take the initiative to call him, he would never do that. As Luo Fan spoke, his figure gradually appeared in front of the fourth senior brother. He looked curiously at the fourth senior brother, who seemed to have undergone great changes compared to before, but also seemed to have not changed at all. Seeing this, the fourth senior brother took a deep breath and said, "Yes, but I have something to tell you, senior." As he spoke, his expression became a little inexplicable. He seemed to be a little hesitant and a little determined. It was as if he was struggling whether to say it or not, as if he was weighing the consequences after saying it. "Oh, What's the matter? Luo Fan smiled faintly and asked. Although he was not clear about what the fourth senior brother was going to say, he did not feel nervous because of the fourth senior brother's behavior. He was very calm and wanted to know what the fourth senior brother wanted to say. This was a kind of absolute confidence. He was confident that nothing the fourth senior brother said would cause irreversible consequences. Seeing Luo Fan's behavior, the fourth senior brother finally suppressed all kinds of hesitation in his heart and said, "Senior, do you know why you can be successful in every level of the road to Tao Master? Why do many Tao Masters not stop your various presumptuous behaviors, but acquiesce and even encourage them?" Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, "Isn't it because for them, everything in the road to Tao Master is insignificant? I used to think so. For many Tao Masters, the road to Tao Master is just the kind of thing that is casually opened up. Even if it is completely destroyed, they will not care about it. But after being reminded by you, I no longer think so," the fourth senior brother said. Hearing this, Luo Fan nodded thoughtfully. If it was just a casually open road to Tao Master, there would naturally be no problem with his understanding. However, if the battle on the road to Tao Master was some kind of game between the True Sage level in the Tao Master universe and the True Sage level in other universes, there was obviously some problem with his thinking. After all, it was just like a person who would pay a lot of attention to a certain game he was playing and would certainly carefully cultivate and remove as many obstacles as possible to the development of his character in the game. If the true sages regarded the road to Tao Master as their incarnation in some kind of game, it was naturally impossible for them to ignore this incarnation, and it was impossible for them to ignore everything on the road to Tao Master. Even if he destroyed the road to Tao Master, they would not care about it at all. Perhaps the rules of war are restricting them. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind, and he finally said so. The fourth senior brother naturally knew what Luo Fan was referring to. He just smiled and said, "This is also a possibility. But even with your means, you should be able to carry out some kind of interference without breaking any strict rules, let alone the omnipotent Tao Master. So, although this possibility exists, the possibility should be quite small." Luo Fan slightly frowned. Indeed, as long as there was a rule, there must be a loophole. The loophole could not be found, not because it did not exist, but because it had not been found. And from the previous situation of the road to Tao Master in the Tao Master universe being invaded, it was obvious that the war agreement between the Tao Masters was not without loopholes. Therefore, it was obvious that if it was really just because of the rules of war, those Tao Masters absolutely had the ability to bypass these rules and directly interfere with him by some inexplicable means. In this way, it was very obvious that the possibility was so small that it was almost impossible compared to the fourth senior brother. Luo Fan's thinking was sharper and deeper. After being reminded by the fourth senior brother, at this time, he completely understood what the other party wanted to say. "I understand." He sighed, and the look in his eyes was a little inexplicable. The aura on his body also changed slightly. At this time, the world group behind him, as well as the light of heaven and earth covering the world group, also produced an indescribable fluctuation, as if suddenly from the deepest part of it revealed a kind of unstable charm, making it difficult for them to maintain a stable state. This appearance made the fourth senior brother admire and vent his anger. A cold smile appeared on his face, and he said, "Senior, it seems that you really understand what I want to say. In that case, I will take my leave." After saying this, he turned to leave. At this time, Luo Fan sighed and said, "Wait." As he spoke, the light of heaven and earth had already appeared around the fourth senior brother, directly penetrating the barrier of the extremely rich power of the world group on his body and directly covering his body. At this moment, he felt that everything inside his body was stagnant, and only his mind could still move slowly. He was directly fixed there. "It's 10 times stronger than I imagined." At this moment, the fourth senior brother made a judgment of Luo Fan's method, and his eyes became indescribably shocked. "Although you made me think of this fact that I almost ignored, your intentions make me unhappy," Luo Fan said. At this moment, The fourth senior brother felt an unimaginable and strong sense of uneasiness in his heart. "So, I've decided to seal you for 1,000,000,000,000 years." Immediately, Luo Fan said. As he said this, the fourth senior brother felt an unimaginably strange existence appear around him out of thin air, directly penetrating all his defenses and even the obstruction of the light of heaven and earth. It directly enveloped his entire body and deeply engraved itself into the depths of his body, causing his thoughts to instantly stagnate. Even his perception of his spirit and body had completely disappeared, leaving only a faintly discernible thought that seemed to exist and yet not exist. It was still sensing the passing of time in an extremely slow manner from the outside. It looked like some kind of magical barrier had directly covered the fourth senior brother's body. Then the fourth senior brother's body trembled and directly disappeared without a trace. No matter how powerful and strange the Tao Master's senses were, it was difficult for him to detect the existence of the heavens. This appearance had been brought about by Luo Fan with the help of his ability to communicate with many levels, and the ability to control the barrier between the levels had directly sealed him into the gap between the levels. As the fourth senior brother was sealed into the gap between the levels, the various tremors and the various unsteadiness that had happened to Luo Fan's body began to gradually recover. In the blink of an eye, he had completely recovered to his original state. He was completely unaffected and did not look like he had before hearing the fourth senior brother's words. "My every move and every thought is under the control of the Taoist master. Everything I do is actually what the Taoist master wants me to do and even manipulates me to do it." Such thoughts reverberated in his mind, and the look in his eyes changed constantly. This idea was deduced from the various questions of the fourth senior brother before, and it was what the fourth senior brother wanted to tell him. And this situation was obviously also deduced by him through various facts. And it could almost be the only explanation for the possibility that all his actions on the road of the Tao Master did not cause any possibility of being dealt with by the Tao Master. Even if he was unwilling to admit it in his heart, he had to agree with this speculation. He could not help but have the idea that everything he had done and everything he had gained since he stepped on the road of the Tao Master was just the result of someone else's manipulation. As soon as this idea appeared, it was self-evident how strong the impact it had on him was. After all, this almost denied him everything. Even if it was Luo Fan, it was impossible for him to be indifferent and not change at all. Chapter 2298. As Luo Fan fell into an inexplicable dilemma, the numerous cultivators on the fourth floor fell into an inexplicable panic. This was because when Luo Fan suppressed the fourth senior brother, his actions were too straightforward and decisive. His decisiveness had already reached the level of an adult facing a baby. This allowed the cultivators to have a complete understanding of Luo Fan's strength, and they finally felt the huge gap between them and Luo Fan. After all, the strength that the fourth senior brother displayed earlier was already many times stronger than theirs. To them, this kind of strength was already considered absolute. And at this time, facing Luo Fan with such strength, the fourth senior brother didn't even have the slightest ability to resist and was directly and decisively sealed. How could they not be shocked? How could they not feel Luo Fan's strength? Even though Luo Fan had shown that he was superior to them time and time again, it was still too far away, and the strength was not intuitive enough. Only at this moment, when they compared themselves with the fourth senior brother, who had already shown enough strength, did they truly feel the meaning of this strength. Naturally, Luo Fan did not care about all of this. At this moment, he had already returned to his own world cluster and was once again enveloped by the light of heaven and earth. As his mind was in a mess, his expression began to change subtly. All his actions were within the Tao Master's expectations, and all his decisions might even be the result of the control of some Tao Masters. This fact was obviously a huge blow to his soul. Although it was not to the extent that his soul needed to be reconstructed like the fourth senior brother and the disciples of the Tao Masters, it was not that easy to calm down. In the midst of all kinds of chaotic thoughts, he slowly sank his mind into the depths of his memories, into his own past. In a trance, his world cluster began to undergo all kinds of indescribable changes. Under the control of the will of heaven and earth, inside the light of heaven and earth, everything in the world cluster, including heaven, earth, and space-time, seemed to be constantly adjusting themselves. All sorts of changes that had never appeared in the world cluster in the past, all sorts of indescribable and wondrous changes kept appearing. During this process, every living being in the world cluster felt an indescribable sense of loss rising from the depths of their hearts. Some of the sharper ones even sensed a strange question being born in the depths of their hearts. What am I? Have my actions always been autonomous? Such philosophical questions began to occupy their minds, causing them to devote most of their thinking into such questions, thinking about the answers to such questions. This kind of question was very strange, but not a single living being felt that it was strange at this time. To them, it was as natural and normal as the sun rising from the east and water flowing from high to low. During this process, the countless heavens and earth, worlds, and space-time seemed to be enveloped in this indescribable atmosphere. All sorts of philosophical thoughts continued to revolve and change during this process, eventually turning into an unimaginably great power that gradually affected the light of heaven and earth, affecting the will of heaven and earth that existed within it. Under such changes, even the light of heaven and earth faintly underwent an inexplicable change, as if there was an indescribable tremor constantly occurring in the light of heaven and earth, as well as a strange light figure that was compressed within, also going through similar thoughts and seeking answers to similar questions. All of this was clearly due to the change in Luo Fan's state of mind at this moment. And this also greatly reduced the pressure on Luo Fuan to the extent that it almost seemed to be one of the reasons why his mind would not collapse and be reshaped. In this strange state of Luo Fan's world cluster, time passed bit by bit. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. In the blink of an eye, 10 billion years had passed. On a certain day after 10 billion years, the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's Path suddenly produced an extremely terrifying tremor. Amidst the tremors, an extremely intense ray of light that seemed to be alive shot into the sky from somewhere on the fourth floor. It crossed the boundless power of creation in an indescribable manner and brazenly enveloped everything within the power of creation. At this moment, all the cultivators on the fourth level of the Tao Master's Path felt an unprecedented and terrifying pressure acting on them out of nowhere. This feeling is a little familiar. Following the emergence of this pressure, the majority of the cultivators had the same thought. Of course, this was only the vast majority. The remaining small number of cultivators who had ascended to the fourth level over the past 10 billion years were extremely unfamiliar with this feeling. They had no idea what this pressure was, nor did they understand why it was so terrifying. It even made them feel as if they had returned to the normal world, and once again experienced the sorrow of not being in control of their own lives. What's going on? Isn't this the fourth level of the Tao Master's Path? Why is there such a terrifying feeling? At this moment, such a thought emerged in their minds. With this thought in mind, the terrifying aura that oppressed them had already changed slightly. Then, they felt that they had left their bodies, left the world group, and even left the fourth level of the Tao Master's Path, and fell into a boundless and terrifying white light. Sure enough, it's like this again. Those cultivators who felt the extremely familiar pressure at this moment, all of them cursed inwardly, and their expressions became ugly. These experienced cultivators were already like this, and the expressions of many of the cultivators who had just ascended and encountered such a change for the first time were obviously even uglier, and all of them seemed a little hysterical. Who was plotting against me? This was a roar that came from everywhere. Such a roar, under the circumstances where they did not hold back, obviously produced a quite shocking effect. If it was in a normal world, it would have been enough to destroy most of the world. Even when they were still in the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, there would definitely be a huge movement, like a boundless sea wave, causing the endless creation power to become turbulent. However, it was obvious that this was not an ordinary world, nor was it an ordinary fourth level of the Tao Master's path. This place was the boundless white light, or more specifically, it was the inside of the endless light of the world. Under such circumstances, the various changes that could cause a drastic change in the world could no longer produce any effect. Their furious roars did not cause any changes to the surrounding white light. On the contrary, their auras rapidly weakened as they roared. In an instant, it felt as though they had been completely sealed. The roars also became weaker and weaker, as if something was gradually blocking their throats. In the face of such a change, the cultivators who had just ascended to the fourth level began to be bewildered. They knew what was going on and quickly restrained their roars. While they still had some energy to spare, they hurriedly asked the cultivators, who appeared to be rather helpless, but still rather calm, about what was going on and why this situation had occurred. The calm seniors did not pay much attention to the rookies' bewilderment. At most, they just let them continue watching and told them that they would soon know the answer to this matter. Soon, the answer that the rookies wanted to know was revealed. They saw a figure appear out of thin air in front of everyone. That's right, it was not a fixed location, but in front of every cultivator, no matter where they stood, no matter what direction they were facing. It gave the many cultivators the feeling that this figure was one-on-one with them. This strange change did not attract the attention of many cultivators at first, but soon they discovered the abnormality, and their expressions became more and more bewildered. If they were just ordinary people, it would be natural for them to have such an illusion. After all, not to mention them, even an ordinary cultivator could easily make an ordinary person feel that way when they were facing them. However, they were not ordinary people. They were powerful existences who had ascended to the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. For existences like them, it was extremely difficult to affect their minds. Compared to this, it was as easy as flipping one's hand. However, at this moment, it was not just one, but countless cultivators had the same change. How could they not be shocked? It could be said that this instant sensation was even more shocking than having their consciousnesses forcibly snatched out of their own worlds and bodies. What will you all do next? At this moment, the figure spoke. However, although it was just a figure, the voice and content that everyone heard were different. There might be some overlap, but most of them did not interfere with each other and did not affect each other. And these words were aimed at each of their actions in the next hundreds of millions of years, and even any gains in their cultivation, as well as all kinds of psychological activities and spiritual impact that they would have in the end. It felt like that person was directly looking at their future and describing it bit by bit. Hearing this lengthy description, the countless cultivators felt their hairs stand on end. What does this mean? It is indeed possible to see through my future with such strength. But what is the purpose of such a description? To show how powerful you are. Actually, there is no need for that. We have truly felt your strength. This was the surprise in the hearts of the cultivators. As for the bewilderment in their hearts, this figure didn't have any other thoughts. He just calmly continued to talk. Fortunately, these cultivators were all experts who had passed the fourth tribulation, which was already unimaginably powerful. This allowed them to easily accept the figure describing their actions and gains in the next hundreds of millions of years in a way that ordinary living beings could not understand. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to understand or comprehend the actions of certain beings over the past hundreds of millions of years. Even if this figure could use such a strange method to recount the actions of certain beings in such a short period of time, in just a few words. Even with all kinds of inexplicable cooperation, the conversation in the end lasted for several hours before it ended. When it was over, before the cultivators could react, the white light began to undergo a strange change. An extremely vast world appeared, and all of the cultivators felt an indescribably terrifying power envelop them. It pulled their bodies straight into the world. Their wills and memories were not damaged, but their power abilities, and might rapidly dissipate it in that instant. In the end, when everything calmed down, they had truly entered the world and became one of the living beings in this strange world. They had completely lost all of their power, as if they had turned into an extremely ordinary living being in this world, apart from the huge amount of memories that they originally had as experts who had passed the fourth tribulation. Only at this moment did the cultivators react, and they matched their current experiences with the things that the figure had told them. In the content of the description, their experiences seemed to be the same as now. They were sealed into this unimaginable world, as if they had become the natives of this world. What's going on? You're telling us everything, but you're going to make arrangements based on what we know. This was the bewilderment in the cultivators' hearts. Let me see if you can break through the fates that I've given you. At this moment, a voice rang out in everyone's ears, causing them to be shocked and furious at the same time. All sorts of curses, roars, and pleas soared into the sky in an instant. They wanted the person who spoke to hear their demands and stop this ridiculous arrangement. Of course, since this arrangement had already been implemented, it was obvious that it had already been carefully considered. How could it be so easily overturned? It was obvious that their demands would not be answered. Chapter 2299. At this time, Luo Fan floated in the center of his own world group with his eyes closed, but his mind had already locked on the light of heaven and earth that had covered the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. On the surface, the light of heaven and earth was still the same as the original light that seemed to be alive, but it seemed to have been magnified countless times. However, inside it, in a range that ordinary creatures could not sense or understand, the appearance of the light of heaven and earth was already fundamentally different. On the inside, there had already been a tremendous change. An extremely vast world had replaced the original pure light of heaven and earth, spreading inside the light of heaven and earth. The essence of this world was not high, but it was a little stronger than the vast thousand worlds. At most, it could barely be called a world that was close to a perfect world. However, because of the protection and support of the light of heaven and earth, the strength and stability of this world were far beyond that of an ordinary world. Even the restrictive and shackling ability of the world was many times stronger than that of an ordinary world. At least, in an ordinary world, the experts of the fourth tribulation who were trapped in this time could not easily suppress all their strength, power, and divine sense. In this world, all the experts of the fourth tribulation, whether they were the disciples of the Tao Master or the rogue cultivators, only had the memory of their own cultivation left. Apart from that, there was no trace of other extraordinary power left. Such a difference naturally did not mean that the help of the light of heaven and earth naturally made this world more advanced than the great heaven and earth. On the contrary, even with the help of the light of heaven and earth, the essence of this world was still inferior to that of a perfect world, let alone that of the great heaven and earth. The reason why there was such a great disparity between the performance of the two was actually very simple, because what the great heaven and earth needed was balance, and to cultivate enough true sages. In this way, all his power would naturally be scattered into countless factors related to the heaven and earth, and naturally, there would not be too much power in the aspects of restrictive and shackling ability. In contrast, the world that Luo Fan had opened up in the light of heaven and earth was far inferior, but almost all the power was compressed into the restrictive and suppressing ability. Under such circumstances, it was not strange for there to be such a gap. How will you perform when you know your destiny? Luo Fan's thoughts echoed in his mind at this time. At this moment, he appeared to be quite different from how he was 10 billion years ago. His eyes seemed to have become much deeper, but there seemed to be a hint of blankness hidden within, making his profoundness seem like a rootless duckweed floating in the air. There was a faint feeling that it would naturally dissipate with the slightest ripple. Over the past 10 billion years, he had thought about many things. He had studied the questions that his fourth senior brother had told him in order to take revenge on him countless times, and he had come to countless conclusions. He already knew what he should do and what attitude he should take. At this moment, What he needed to do was use the performance of all the cultivators to truly eliminate the last bit of confusion and hesitation in his heart. The more powerful an existence was, the more they abhorred their own indulgence. Back when Luo Fan was in the Earth universe, he felt that he had been secretly controlled by the 7 sages of the Earth universe. So he brazenly abandoned the sage imprint that the 7 sages had left on him. Later, when he had the chance to leave the Earth universe, he left without hesitation. That was back then, before his cultivation had entered the retribution stage. Now, he had already passed the 5th major tribulation and was about to welcome the 6th major tribulation. Compared to before, he was hundreds of millions of times stronger. In terms of self-fulfillment and autonomy, it was not something that could be compared to the past. Under such circumstances, suddenly discovering that everything he did was very likely to be controlled by a dark hand behind the scenes, of course, that feeling would only be more uncomfortable than before. It was because of this discomfort that he could not find a way to completely get rid of it. That was why he was so conflicted and spent 10 billion years thinking to find a solution. What's going on? Why is it that I clearly tried my best to avoid what he said, but I still can't change anything? In that world, all the cultivators fell into panic. After entering this world, they were sure that all of their experiences were in accordance with what Luo Fan had told them before. When all of their actions and encounters in the next 100 million years corresponded to what Luo Fan had told them, they were naturally extremely unhappy. Even the cultivators who were described as having endless fortuitous encounters, advancing by leaps and bounds, and finally obtaining countless benefits that would still be effective even after they left this world in a short span of 100 million years, did not show any signs of joy at this situation. Just like what was said before, the more powerful an existence was, the more they abhorred their own indulgence. Although these cultivators were far inferior to Luo Fan, they were still powerhouses who had passed the 4th tribulation. In an ordinary world, any one of them could easily wipe out the world with one hand and shatter the river of time. Such an existence, no matter how one looked at it, was definitely an absolutely powerful existence. Naturally, they also abhorred indulgence to the bone. Therefore, as they realized this, they began to consciously deviate from what Luo Fan had told them and deviate from the various encounters that Luo Fan had arranged. For example, in the narration, they were clearly going in one direction, but they purposely went in another direction. For example, when they encountered some creatures, they were clearly supposed to treat them well, but they went in the opposite direction and directly killed the creatures. In this way, it was almost like they were singing a different tune. Unfortunately, in the end, they discovered that everything was so strange. When they changed directions, they would soon discover that this direction was actually the direction in the narration. When they killed creatures, they would soon discover that the content of the narration was actually to kill them, and not to treat them well like what they had previously understood. It felt like regardless of their resistance, it was in line with the content of the narration and the fate that Luo Fan had arranged for them. When this happened once or twice, they would naturally suspect that they had misunderstood the content of the narration. However, when it happened again and again, and when they resisted again and again, they achieved the goal of the narration. How could these cultivators not know that something was wrong? What on earth is he doing? Why can't we get rid of it no matter what? The cultivators murmured with frustration in their hearts. Vaguely, an indescribable fear surged up. Although they had completely lost their powers, superpowers, and powers, they still retained their original cultivation memories. Even though they were almost powerless when they first entered this world, they only needed to spend some time and rely on their memories to find the cultivation method that was most suitable for this world and obtain extraordinary power. Of course, the world that Luo Fan had opened up could even completely suppress all of their powers, divine abilities, and methods with the help of the light of heaven and earth. Naturally, it could also restrict the power that they had cultivated. Under such restrictions, even though the power they cultivated could bring them supreme divine abilities and extraordinary power, it was still impossible for them to obtain such power. However, they couldn't cause too much damage to this world. It was as if they had borrowed these powers from the world. Since they borrowed powers from the world, they naturally couldn't destroy this world. This situation was the same for the billions of cultivators here. Even though they had developed countless different powers and cultivation systems through their own imagination, none of them were enough to change this fact. This was exactly the same as what Luo Fan had told them before, and it confirmed that everything that Luo Fan had told them was absolute and couldn't be changed after confirming this. Some cultivators went crazy and began to destroy everything they saw. They killed everyone they saw, destroyed everything they saw, and even self-destructed at some point. However, apart from those who self-destructed, those cultivators who had gone crazy found out that all of their actions, even their actions after going crazy, were in line with everything that Luo Fan had said at the beginning. They were in line with all of the actions and experiences that Luo Fan had arranged for them. This made them feel even more desperate. What are you trying to do? We know that you're powerful, but you don't have to show it like this, do you? One cultivator after another roared furiously. Their voices were extremely shrill, causing those who heard them to involuntarily feel despair from the bottom of their hearts. Those who self-destructed didn't disappear right away. Instead, they re-entered the reincarnation cycle of this world and were reborn. However, after reincarnating, a portion of their memories had been obscured. It was no longer the same as when they had first entered this world. All of their memories were intact, and they could clearly remember everything they had experienced since birth. Of course, the loss wasn't much. It was just that they had forgotten their previous madness and despair. Under such circumstances, they once again fell into the same state as before. First, they used all their means to challenge the fate that Luo Fan had arranged for them. When they were powerless, they brazenly fell into despair. In the end, they completely collapsed and self-destructed. Then, they reincarnated again and lost even more memories. In the end, when they completely lost their memories of what Luo Fan had told them after they entered this world, they finally returned to normal. When they returned to normal, their performance was much better than before. In that kind of normal performance, their growth speed was actually faster than that of the other cultivators. They had actually entered the peak of development that Luo Fan had mentioned before. The cultivators who hadn't self-destructed were all horrified by their performance. Even if they were dissatisfied with the current arrangements, they were unwilling to fall into the same state as those who had self-destructed. One had to know that accepting arrangements in a daze, acting under someone's control in a daze, was something worse than death for them. In comparison, now that they knew everything and understood that they were indulging themselves, even though it was extremely uncomfortable and painful, it was still much better than being confused and at a loss like a puppet, thinking that they were wise. It was precisely because many cultivators had lost their memories of what Luo Fan had said that the evolution of this world was more random and natural. The cultivators who remembered could control themselves and force themselves not to act according to Luo Fan's arrangements. Those cultivators could not. In this situation where they intentionally avoided and acted according to fate, the effects of their activities would naturally be more in line with the arrangements of fate. For example, between two cultivators, one with memories and the other without, there would be some sort of communication and even some sort of friendship between them in the arrangement. In this situation, if the cultivator with memories wanted to change this fate, he would wholeheartedly avoid the cultivator without memories. He would not want to have any interaction with the cultivator with memories. However, the cultivator without memories would not have such thoughts. Perhaps he would be led by some kind of aura and change his actions, causing him to collide with the cultivator with memories. This kind of situation was not difficult to happen. In this way, the cultivators felt as if the extremely tight net of fate had become even more tenacious, even tighter, and even more impossible to break free from. The flow of time within the light of the world was completely under Luo Fan's control. From the beginning, he had already accelerated the flow of time to the point where his body was hundreds of millions of times faster. Almost every second, and every breath felt like tens of thousands of years had passed. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan had only watched for a few days, but the activities of the cultivators in that world had already completely changed the entire world. Before they knew it, time was approaching. It had been over 100 million years since Luo Fan had said that everything they would do would be decided. As time approached, the cultivators who had been following the rules for 100 million years felt a sense of relief. There was even a vague sense of anticipation in their hearts. They looked forward to how they would regain their freedom when the time came. At this moment, Luo Fan spoke. In the next 100 million years, you will... These words appeared in the ears of every cultivator out of nowhere. Chapter 2300. They had thought that time was up, and they would either be able to escape, or even if they could not escape and leave this world, they would no longer need to be controlled by their every move and experience. However, they did not expect that before they could even catch their breath, a new fate would arrive, and it would be told to them the same way as before. It went without saying how sorrowful and despairing they felt. In this despair, the cultivators made different choices. Some directly fell into self-destruction, some became hysterical, and some were completely numb. They were like walking corpses, acting according to fate. However, no matter what choice they made, a subtle resentment started to accumulate in this world. The resentment came from the depths of their hearts. It was resentment towards the world, towards Luo Fan, and towards this damned arrangement of fate. In the face of this resentment, even the world, which was supported by the light of the world, was slowly being eroded. The various laws of the world, the various laws of time, space, and even everything else began to undergo various indescribable and subtle changes. If Luo Fan wasn't in control of everything and this situation continued to develop, it would definitely cause the resentment to accumulate to a point that the world couldn't contain in the infinitely distant future. When it suddenly erupted, it would definitely cause unimaginable damage to this part of the world. At that time, even if Luo Fan arranged everything properly and relied on the will of the heavens and the earth within the light of the heavens and the earth to arrange the fate of all the cultivators, it would still be impossible to maintain the integrity of the heavens and the earth. The various arrangements would definitely be torn into pieces and become a joke in the end. However, it was obvious that everything would only develop to this stage without Luo Fan's participation. Now that Luo Fan was controlling and guiding everything from the outside, and even the will of the world within the light of heaven and earth was acting according to his will, the light of heaven and earth would naturally deal with the resentment. When the resentment reached a certain level, the will of the world would detonate the resentment through all kinds of extremely ingenious and mysterious methods, causing the resentment to be stimulated from its originally invisible state. The hidden dangers that could have accumulated to the point of causing a huge impact on the entire structure of the world would be vented through this method. Although this would affect the world to a certain extent, the amount of resentment would not be enough to affect the integrity of this world, and the hidden dangers would be completely eliminated. In the eyes of the cultivators in this world, this was a great tribulation that would affect the entire world every few 100 million years. In the Great Tribulation, many cultivators died or were destroyed. Even the world itself fell into a process of destruction and rebirth. This made it seem like Luo Fan was deliberately using all sorts of methods to torment them, causing the cultivators to feel even more resentment towards Luo Fan. The more resentment there was, the more frequently Luo Fan had to vent his resentment. As a result, the frequency of the tribulations also became higher and higher. Just like that, it formed an endless cycle, causing the world to fall into the cycle of tribulations again and again. Time continued to pass in this world. 100 million years, 200 million years, 300 million years, 1 billion years, 10 billion years. Every few 100 million years, the cultivators would hear Luo Fan's narration of what they would experience in the next 100 million years. This narration would match what they would encounter in the next 100 million years, causing the cultivators to be like insects that had fallen into a spider's web. No matter how they struggled, they could not break free. In the first few tens of billions of years, there were still cultivators who could not withstand the terror and fell into self-destruction. However, as the number of times continued to increase, the number of cultivators who fell into self-destruction gradually decreased as the number of times increased, and they were unable to escape from this state. Tens of billions of years later, after hearing about Luo Fan's fate, there were almost no longer any living beings who fell into self-destruction. However, compared to the complete disappearance of the living beings who fell into self-destruction, the number of living beings who became walking corpses continued to increase. After tens of billions of years, at first glance, everything in this world seemed to be the same as before. It was still full of vitality, and there were still cultivators everywhere. There were all kinds of civilizations everywhere. Many cultivators were obediently playing their roles in this world, displaying the mortal world of the cultivation world and a myriad of emotions in people's hearts. However, if one looked closely, they would find that the gazes of the countless living beings were hiding a kind of madness and numbness. Their every move seemed to come from their hearts, but it was as if there was some kind of invisible power controlling and guiding them. What joy, what sadness, what pain, what hatred, what excitement, what horror, all of it only touched the surface of their hearts. They couldn't touch the core of their hearts, and they couldn't express all kinds of emotions as if they were truly from the bottom of their hearts. In this world filled with living beings, there was naturally a sense of death in the depths. If an ordinary person came here, they might not be able to stay for long before committing suicide to escape. Luo Fan naturally sensed the changes in the atmosphere in this world, and he knew the source of it. However, he could not do anything about it, nor did he want to deal with it. This was because he had not achieved his goal yet. He had yet to see a single cultivator's body that was able to give him any sort of revelation. The many cultivators seemed to have accepted their fate, but in fact, all of this was only on the surface, and it was just their performance in the first stage. After enough time had passed, the reaction they made would be the reaction that truly burst forth from the depths of their hearts. This was what Luo Fan wanted to see. Let's start quickly. Sensing the unimaginable flow of time in the world inside the light of heaven and earth, such a thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. There was a deep sense of anticipation in the depths of his eyes. The difference in the flow of time inside and outside was so huge. Only 100 years had passed outside, but in the world inside the light of heaven and earth, trillions of years had passed. Such a long period of time was definitely not a short period of time, even for these cultivators who had already undergone the fourth tribulation. After such a long time, the cultivators in this world had gradually gotten used to life in this world. They had unknowingly gotten used to the arrangement of fate that happened once in 100 million years that they detested. In the bottom of their hearts, their originally numb mentality had unknowingly burst forth with new light and new power. This light and power that came from accepting the arrangements of the world dispelled the numbness in their hearts and reignited their desire to cultivate. As a result, the many cultivators in this world became more and more natural, and the lifeless atmosphere had unknowingly disappeared without a trace. Of course, this was only the case for most cultivators. In the end, there would still be some cultivators with extremely strong wills who persisted with themselves and rejected all of this. They rejected the state of their fate being arranged by others. However, compared to the cultivators who had accepted this, the number of such cultivators was extremely small, and their impact on the overall situation was extremely small. It was almost negligible. Facing this kind of fate, those cultivators with extremely strong wills thought of countless ways to resist the arrangements of fate. They deliberately went against the arrangements of fate. If fate wanted them to go east, they would go west. If fate wanted them to stop, they would move. If fate wanted them to move, they would stop. These things were just the simplest and most common means of resistance, creating all kinds of techniques, refining all kinds of magic treasures, and using all kinds of strange powers to shield themselves, isolate themselves from the world, and isolate their connection with fate were just the first steps. Directly using their powerful wills to shake the will of the world, using their own power to erode the world and erode fate. That was their final choice. Of course, their actions were actually already arranged by fate. Although those cultivators were extremely frustrated with this, they still used all of their means to complete this process. It was unknown how many trillions of years had passed, but they had even created thousands upon thousands of wondrous techniques, mysterious magical abilities, and profound magical treasures that shocked even Luo Fan. Among them, many of the techniques, and magic treasures were so powerful that if they were used in a battle between cultivators, they might be able to directly increase the strength of a fourth tribulation cultivator by more than 10 times. However, all of this was completely useless when it came to their ultimate goal, which was to struggle free from the control of fate. What they should do was still the same. The arrangements of fate that appeared every 100 million years still appeared in their ears and drilled into their hearts. Faced with this, ordinary cultivators would have long lost hope. However, these cultivators were worthy of being existences that maintained their firm wills for so many billions of years. At this time, they still did not give up on their wills. They still wholeheartedly devoted themselves to the research of these methods. They worked hard to create more and more powerful techniques, powers, and magic treasures to resist fate. As the other cultivators increasingly accepted the arranged fate, the cultivators who were still persevering unknowingly began to group together and formed an organization that specialized in resisting fate. They hid behind the scenes and only focused on researching their own things. They did not care about the various tribulations in the outside world. They did not even care about the tribulations caused by the accumulation of resentment in the outside world. If you guys can research it, then why did I put in so much effort to condense the worldly light? Luo Fan secretly shook his head at those cultivators who still persisted in resisting fate. After all, the fates of these cultivators were not actually arranged by Luo Fan. Even if his will was used as a guide, he was definitely not the one who directly took action and arranged their fates. It could be said that what really arranged all of this and caused countless cultivators to fall into a state of fate manipulation was actually the will of the world inside the worldly light. After all, these cultivators were at least fourth tribulation powerhouses. Even though Luo Fan was a fifth tribulation powerhouse who could sense when the sixth tribulation would descend, he could not toy with them like he was toying with the wills of mortals. Being invincible at this level did not mean that one could casually manipulate existences that were weaker than oneself, no matter how many there were. The true thing that completely restricted their power and perfectly arranged their fates for the next 100 million years was actually the hidden will of the world inside the worldly light. For the will of the world that could control everything in the world, and its way of thinking was intrinsically different from the will of living beings. Controlling the fates of living beings was simply like an instinct to it. It did not even consume much of its energy. Even though these cultivators who fell into the worldly light were fourth tribulation powerhouses, it was the same for the will of the world. Therefore, if these cultivators wanted to resist their own fates, they would actually have to resist the will of the world inside the worldly light. In a situation where they did not have the worldly light, this was obviously almost impossible. Because of this, although Luo fans secretly admired them and admired the remarkable abilities, wondrous techniques, and magic treasures that they created, he did not pay much attention to them after paying attention to them for a while. In contrast, he paid more attention to the cultivators who had already accepted the arrangements of fate and lived and cultivated according to the arrangements of fate. The reason why he did not pay attention to the cultivators who wholeheartedly wanted to resist when he was searching for a revelation was even simpler. Instead, he paid attention to the cultivators who had accepted the arrangements of fate. This was because his own fate was extremely similar to that of the cultivators who had already accepted the arrangements of fate. After all, it was only the will of the world inside the worldly light that arranged the fates of those cultivators. However, the one who arranged his fate was the supreme, eternal, indestructible, omniscient, omnipotent true saint. As long as one could obtain the worldly light, one would naturally be able to resist the worldly light. Although it was difficult, there were still conditions. However, if one wanted to resist the true saint and the fate that they had arranged for him, it was obviously not something that could be achieved by obtaining the worldly light. Only by becoming a true saint himself would there be a chance. As for becoming a true saint, compared to condensing the worldly light, it went without saying how many times more difficult it was to become a true saint. With Luo Fan's current strength and realm, he did not know how far he was from becoming a true saint. Chapter 23:01. Therefore, for Luo Fan, it was obvious that only those cultivators who were helpless against fate could be regarded as cultivators who had almost the same fate as him. Their choices were also enlightening to him. Although the cultivators could guess that Luo Fan was paying attention to them, they did not have the mood to care about it. After all, based on their current situation, it would be strange if Luo Fan did not pay attention to them. But even if they knew, what could they do? Compared to Luo Fan's attention, the most important thing for them now was to survive. Such an attitude was inadvertently in line with Luo Fan's expectations, allowing Luo Fan to have more opportunities to obtain the enlightenment he wanted to obtain. The number of cultivators on the 4th level of the Tao Sovereign Path was quite large, almost in the hundreds of billions. With such a large number, there were naturally all kinds of cultivators with different personalities. Even if they had all accepted the fate that Luo Fan had given them and lived and cultivated in this world, there were still some differences in their behavior because of their different personalities. Some cultivators seemed to have lost their memories and did not care about anything, only acting according to fate. Some were resentful. Even if they did not show it, there was still a charm behind their actions as if they did not care about anything. Some are more proactive. In this kind of fate, they try their best to find all kinds of flaws that might appear, looking for a way to obtain more benefits through this kind of fate. These different personalities and different choices naturally gave Luo Fan a lot of inspiration. When he looked at them, it was as if he was looking at the situation when he made different choices. For a moment, he naturally paid more attention to their choices and the results of their choices. Time continued to pass as he paid attention to them like this. After that, the world fell into this never-ending cycle of death for another few trillion years. The arrangement of fate again and again determined the direction of the entire world, including all the encounters of the cultivators in it. After so many cycles, the original will of the many cultivators had also been revealed. The image that was originally like a dense fog had covered their hearts, but after the erosion of time, it had already become scattered and disorderly. This was related to the cultivators themselves. Relatively speaking, what Luo Fan was more concerned about was the different outcomes of the cultivators' choices. It had already become clear, allowing Luo Fan to finally obtain what he wanted. It must be known that although those cultivators were all 4th tribulation experts, their power, abilities, and everything else had been completely sealed by the light of the world after entering the world. Even if they had complete memories of cultivation, they could only rely on their own efforts in this world if they wanted to regain their power, abilities, and might. Although the results of their efforts were related to their memories, to a certain extent, it could be said that it was determined by their memories. However, the coordination between the heavens and the earth was also very important. Just like that, it was clear that their attitude towards this world and their attitude towards cultivation in this world would, to a great extent, determine their cultivation achievements in this world. The difference in cultivation achievements caused by this difference in attitude might not be visible in a short period of time, because the most important thing in a short period of time was actually memory. However, as time passed, for example, if they stayed in this world for trillions of years, the situation would obviously be completely different. With the accumulation of such a long period of time, the originally secondary influence on one's attitude had unknowingly risen to an extremely important level. In other words, the cultivators who had reached the pinnacle of strength in this world were all cultivators who had a better attitude towards having their fates decided than other cultivators. This also meant that their attitudes were enough for Luo Fan to take into consideration. Actively ignoring? Luo Fan summed it up a little and determined the common ground of the attitude of these cultivators who stood at the peak of the world towards fate. There was one thing in common between the attitudes these cultivators held towards the arrangements of their fates for the next 100 million years that appeared in their ears every 100 million years. That was, he almost completely disregarded fate, but in the midst of his disregard, he followed his own heart with incomparable determination. Regardless of whether his own heart coincided with the arrangement of fate or not, he didn't care and only acted according to his own heart. As for whether the outcome would overlap with fate or be different from fate, they didn't care at all. This attitude was what Luo Fan had summed up now. Active disregard. It was precisely because of this active ignoring that no matter how wonderful the arrangements of fate were, they couldn't be tempted to get close to fate. No matter how bad the arrangements of fate were, they wouldn't deliberately defy or oppose it because of how bad it was. With this attitude, they naturally carried out their own path of cultivation with unimaginable firmness. The result of this firmness was that their cultivation in this world was many times smoother than other cultivators. Unknowingly, they had already walked to the peak of this world and became existences that could easily crush the experts in the outside world, who could easily crush them. And this kind of harvest, in turn, strengthened their will, causing them to increasingly recognize their own path and the correctness of their persistence. In this way, it could be imagined that as long as they continued to maintain this attitude, even after they left this world, their cultivation would inevitably be more smooth, and their future would definitely be several times broader than before. From this point of view, this time, Luo Fan had pulled them into this world to conduct experiments, which could also be regarded as their fated chance. However, these cultivators were unlikely to be grateful to Luo Fan. Actively ignoring. This was also a way that Luo Fan had previously deduced to deal with the fact that he seemed to be completely controlled by a true divine, and every move he made was an opportunity arranged by a true divine. In addition, there were also options to completely ignore, escape the path of a Tao Master, and leave the Tao Master Great World. However, at this time, when the best answer appeared, the other options were obviously no longer necessary. Completely ignoring and actively ignoring seemed to be the same approach, but in fact, there was a huge difference in essence. Completely ignoring was almost like deceiving oneself and deceiving oneself. One day, one would not be able to deceive or deceive oneself, and when that time came, the result would inevitably be worrying. On the other hand, actively ignoring him was different. Actively ignoring was a situation where one clearly recognized the truth and ignored that kind of manipulation, that kind of control, and only decided and chose everything based on one's own cultivation path and one's own heart. In this way, because one knew what the true self was, and even more so knew one's own insignificance and understood one's own shortcomings, one would naturally not easily have such negative emotions as complacency and arrogance when cultivating, and one's self-awareness would also become more and more profound with time and time again cultivation, and in the end, the cultivation future would naturally become more and more bright. As for the other options, the choice to escape the path of a Tao Master and leave the Tao Master Great World seemed to completely cut off all control, so that those Tao Masters could not continue to control him. This choice seemed to take drastic measures and cut off all hidden dangers, but it was only a temporary solution. After all, there were true sages everywhere. There were Tao Masters in this Tao Master Great World, but in other worlds, other perfect worlds, there were no true sages. Could he guarantee that after he left this Tao Master Grand World and entered another Grand World, the true saint-level existences there would let him go? If they did not let him go, then what was the difference between the current situation and the current situation? Therefore, this choice of completely escaping was the worst choice. Apart from these choices, there were still many other choices. However, there were more or less hidden dangers. In contrast, it was obvious that this option, which had obviously been verified by experiments, was the most appropriate choice, and it was also the most in line with what Luo Fan wanted. In this way, It was obviously a very simple matter to make a choice. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart moved, and the light of heaven and earth that spread throughout the entire fourth level of the Tao Master Path began to slowly converge. As the light of heaven and earth converged, the world that existed within the light of heaven and earth began to gradually collapse. Countless fine cracks appeared everywhere in the world, and everything began to be destroyed from the deepest depths of the world. At this moment, all the cultivators came to a realization. The expert has already gotten what he wants. We are free. With this thought, the countless cultivators were at a loss for a moment. Although they did not know how much time had passed in the outside world, for them, it had actually been countless trillions of years. Such a long time, even for these cultivators at the fourth level of the Tao Master Path, was definitely not short time. For such a long time, they had been in this world, in this state of being completely controlled by the fate that Luo Fan had given them, but they had unknowingly become used to it. Now, the world suddenly collapsed, and the voice that determined their fate no longer appeared in their ears. They were a little at a loss and did not know what to do. This kind of mentality is really terrifying. After all, they were experts of the fourth tribulation, and they had a very deep understanding of their own minds. Therefore, these cultivators quickly came to their senses and cut off all kinds of confusion in their hearts. Each of them showed a relaxed and helpless expression. The world continued to collapse. In a short time, the whole world had completely collapsed into countless fine fragments like smoke, filling the vision of all the cultivators and covering everything in the outside world. Then, before they could react, an invisible force pulled them out of the smoke and out of the lifelike light. They returned to their own world cluster and then to their own bodies. Everything seemed to have returned to the beginning, as if nothing had happened. It's only been 3 years. After returning to their bodies, these cultivators began to feel the changes in their bodies. In the blink of an eye, they knew that after being trapped in that strange world, their bodies had only spent 3 years. In these 3 years, they felt like they had spent trillions of years. Even experts of the fourth tribulation could not react to such a huge difference in time. At this time, in the fourth level of the path of Tao Master, the light of ascension kept shining. One by one, the cultivators disappeared from the fourth level and directly entered the fifth level that had been sealed. The seal has been lifted. Seeing that those cultivators had successfully ascended, the remaining cultivators were all surprised and delighted. It should be noted that even the fourth senior brother's ascension seemed to have failed. Now that it had only been a few years, the seal had actually been lifted. This was simply a shocking piece of news. Immediately, those cultivators who had sufficient foundation started the process of ascension one by one. They began to merge with their own world cluster and ascended to the fifth level. At this time, Luo Fan, who had already withdrawn the light of heaven and earth, sensed the continuous light of ascension, but he only smiled faintly. He naturally knew the reason why those cultivators chose to ascend at this time. It was obvious that they had ascended to avoid him. Even if ascension was not the best choice for them, they could still gain a lot in the fourth level, and there was still a lot of room for improvement in their cultivation realms. However, because of his actions these few times, they were obviously scared out of their wits. Compared to the benefits that they could obtain in the fourth level, it was obvious that they were more concerned about the danger of being controlled by him at any time. What a wise choice. At that moment, he softly murmured, "It seems that you still don't want to give up." At this time, a voice suddenly came into Luo Fan's ears. This voice came very strangely. Even with Luo Fan's control of many levels and the detection of his light of heaven and earth, he could not find the source of this voice at all. It was as if the voice had just appeared in his ears out of thin air. Which fellow Taoist is it? After Luo Fan's heart was shocked, he regained his calmness and said indifferently. At this time, a faintly discernible figure appeared in front of him out of thin air. Chapter 23:02. This figure was a young man in his 20s. However, he was only able to see his age. His true appearance was indistinct, as though there was a layer of fog covering his face. The effect of this kind of concealment was quite strong. Even Luo Fan could not see through the fog and see his real face. This alone was enough to show that this person was much stronger than Luo Fan in some aspects. Not to mention the fact that he had appeared here in such a manner and was directly facing Luo Fan. This showed how extraordinary he was, and it was difficult for others to ignore him anymore. "You've gone too far," the man said at this time. With these words, Luo Fan felt an indescribable sense of crisis emerging from the depths of his heart. It was as if at this moment, he had turned from a powerful expert of the 5 tribulations to a naked baby in the snow. This feeling of helplessness made him unable to help summoning the light of heaven and earth. His body began to emit a light that was like a living thing. With this light, the incomparably strong sense of crisis weakened a little. Although it still existed, at least it was not to the extent of making him appear on the snow as a naked baby. In the face of such a change, the man who appeared in front of him looked indifferent. He just quietly stared at him. The pair of originally blurred eyes suddenly became clear. In those eyes, there seemed to be infinite heaven and earth, infinite universe, and infinite power. An indescribable suction appeared in those eyes, faintly penetrating all the defenses on Luo Fan's body, penetrating his body, penetrating his soul, and reaching the root of his soul, reaching straight to the core of his soul. I didn't expect that I would be treated like this. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. This method of completely bypassing all the strength and appearance of the opponent and directly targeting the core of the opponent's soul was originally his best method. In fact, the method he used to deal with all the other practitioners on the 4th level of the Tao Master's path was actually similar. But now this young man before him had actually used this technique on him, and it actually made him feel as if he was unable to defend against it. How could he not feel inexplicably emotional? Of course, while he was feeling emotional, he had no intention of surrendering. One had to know that with his methods of toying with the minds of other cultivators, if the core of his mind really fell into the hands of others, then what awaited him would be a dark abyss with no way out. At that time, the freedom of one's will and life would no longer be under one's control. How could he accept such a fate? At that moment, he let out a roar as a mysterious light began to shine from the depths of his heart. This light was bright and dazzling, containing an unimaginable independent aura, as if it was different from any other world. This was the aura of the world of loss. It was an independent aura that completely belonged to Luo Fan. It was different from any worldview that was popular in any worldview. This absolutely independent aura had an absolute exclusivity. At this moment, his heart had already obtained this exclusivity, so that any foreign object that approached his heart would be under pressure that it did not have before. It was like the kind of suction that came from the eyes of the young man in front of him and directly targeted the core of the soul. Under the effect of this exclusion, it began to retreat little by little and finally withdrew from Luo Fan's mind, making him feel lighter both physically and mentally. The feeling that his mind was about to lose its autonomy in the next moment, and the feeling of losing its ability to move had completely disappeared. At this time, there was a look of surprise in the young man's eyes as he said, "So you chose the opposite path. No wonder you are so unsociable." Who are you?" Luo Fan stared at the young man in front of him with extreme vigilance. He could feel that the young man in front of him was not a physical existence. In other words, it was not a cultivator's real body, doppelganger, incarnation, or even a projection. It was an extremely strange and mysterious existence, one that even he did not understand at this moment. This kind of existence was between reality and illusion. It seemed to exist and not exist at the same time. It had the characteristics of a real thing, but also the characteristics of an illusory thing that did not exist. This characteristic allowed him to exert some of the power that a physical body could exert here, and also allowed him to avoid the punishment of things that should not appear here. From this strange characteristic, it could already be known that the existence in front of him must have come from a higher level of the Tao Master Path. Moreover, It was definitely not the Tao Master Path of the 5th or 6th level, which was very close to the 4th level, but possibly the projection of the Tao Master Path of the 7th level, or even higher. This situation at this time made Luo Fan's heart involuntarily have some kind of ominous premonition at this time. The barrier that existed in the entire 4th level, which divided the entire 4th level into the domain of the Tao Master and the domain of the rogue cultivators, seemed to have been set up by a very high-level cultivator. Could it be that the cultivator in front of him was the disciple of the Tao Master who had set up the barrier on the 4th level? My name can't be said here. However, I think you should be able to roughly guess. Yes, it is as you guessed, the young man said indifferently. Hearing this, Luo Fan was shocked. He did not think that there would be any misunderstanding between him and this expert, nor did he think that the speculation in his heart at this time would be different from the speculation in the heart of the expert in front of him. After all, at their level, language was no longer the only way to communicate with each other. Therefore, it was obvious that the cultivator in front of him must be the cultivator who had set up the barrier on the 4th level to divide it. It really is you. Luo Fan sighed. I originally thought that you would either never appear, or you would appear as soon as I broke the barrier. I didn't expect you to actually appear here at this time. At this time, there were 2 layers of light on his body. One was hidden in the inner layer, which contained the incompatibility with everything else in the outside world, as if he was a perfect, independent, and unique individual. The other layer of light was in the outer layer, which was like a living thing. The inner layer of light was triggered from the worldview of laws, and it belonged to the worldview of laws. The outer layer of light was the light of heaven and earth light. These 2 kinds of light were different. The outer layer of heaven and earth light contained infinite power, and it could even put up a fight against existences on the 6th level. Its destructive power and creativity had reached the level of the real world. The inner layer of light, on the other hand, was absolutely perfect. If anything different from this layer of light tried to invade it, it would trigger an intense reaction from the inner layer of light, causing the power of all conceptibility contained in his worldview of laws to pour in. Under normal circumstances, either of these 2 layers of light would be enough to guard against all possible troubles. However, at this time, even with the protection of these 2 layers of light, Luo Fan still did not feel much sense of security. He had an inexplicable feeling that if this powerhouse in front of him really wanted to deal with him, these 2 layers of light would probably not be of much use. Therefore, at this time, behind these 2 layers of light, he was constantly preparing another method. It was something that he had yet to see from any other cultivator. It was the ability to communicate with existences on various levels that corresponded to him. The young cultivator in front of him looked at Luo Fan with a strange feeling in his heart. He clearly felt that the bit of power he projected into this level should be able to easily deal with the other party, but there was always a sense of uneasiness in his heart, as if it was warning him. It was because of this strange vigilance that he did not directly attack Luo Fan at this time. After all, he had projected this bit of power to the 4th level, and he had other tasks to do. Dealing with Luo Fan was just something that he could do in passing. If he could easily get rid of Luo Fan without any losses, then he would naturally not be polite. However, if dealing with Luo Fan could affect his mission, or even cause him to fail his mission, then that was something he could not accept. After weighing for a while, the young man finally sighed and said, "Forget it. Although I don't know what trump card you have, I can't take the risk now. Let's forget about it." Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and felt a wave of displeasure in his heart. He just quietly looked at the young man. In order to avoid being invaded again, you must hand over the authority of the ruler. This level also needs to be divided into the territories of the Tao Master's disciples and the independent cultivators. Do you have any objections? The young man said to Luo Fan. When Luo Fan heard this, he only sneered and said, "Don't try to trick me like I'm a fool. I've heard a little about what the war agreement is. I don't know any of the rules that require the ruler of each level to be a disciple of the Tao Master to ensure peace. Dividing this level into the territory of the Tao Master's disciples and the independent cultivators is even more ridiculous. That's just a pretext for the Tao Master's disciples to control the entire path of the Tao Master. So, you're against it? At this time, the young man looked at Luo Fan and frowned. There seemed to be a surging mania in the depths of his eyes. Well said. At this time, a voice came into Luo Fan's ears. Along with this voice, a strange shadow fell from the sky and brazenly fell on the young man in front of him. Although the illusory figure was strange, it clearly did not exceed the young man's reaction range. At this moment, facing such a sudden illusory figure, his body slightly retreated. In a way that even Luo Fan could not sense, he had already retreated several feet, directly dodging the illusory figure that descended from the sky. Exquisite. At this moment, such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. The retreat of the young man just now seemed ordinary, but in fact, it contained infinite mystery. When it happened, Luo Fan did not have any reaction. He only felt that the figure of the young man seemed to transcend time and space, and when the shadow appeared, the figure had already retreated several feet. However, after the matter was over, every detail of the young man's dodging and every trace of profoundness was replayed in his mind. Although it was just a small movement, in his memory, Luo Fan seemed to be facing infinite heaven and earth, infinite great ways, infinite ideas, and infinite power. It was as if he was not an ordinary creature that was moving, but an extremely vast, incomparably mysterious heaven and earth. At this time, the shadow also appeared. It was another figure. It also looked like a young man, but compared to the previous young man, he was a few years older and looked more straightforward. It's you? The Tao Master's disciple looked at the new young man and frowned. Why can't it be me? If you can come down, why can't I? The straightforward young man laughed and said, I don't remember you rogue cultivators actually caring so much about the situation of the lower levels. The Tao Master's disciple said with a frown. Although he was obviously unhappy, he still remained calm. Haha, of course not in the past, but it's different now. We have hope. The straightforward young man laughed and glanced at Luo Fan. The Tao Master's disciple frowned even more, and for the first time, his eyes were mixed with vigilance as he looked at Luo Fan. Are you going to push him to be the representative of the lower levels? Let him compete with us for the control of the Tao Master's path? As the Tao Master's disciple said so, his aura began to expand, and an inexplicable momentum began to crush Luo Fan and the straightforward young man who had just appeared. It seemed that if the straightforward young man did not give a good answer, he would directly attack. Hearing this, the straightforward young man laughed and said, Of course, can't we? You Tao Master's disciples have been complacent for so long. It's our turn to be complacent for a while, isn't it? At this time, the Tao Master's disciple sneered. What a pity I originally planned to keep him. As he spoke, he raised his hand and slapped toward Luo Fan. With this slap, Luo Fan felt as if the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path had fallen into the palm of the opponent, and with the momentum of the opponent's palm, it crushed toward him. Even though the power of the palm had not yet reached him, he had already felt that the light of heaven and earth around him began to crackle, as if some kind of extremely powerful invisible force was crushing the light of heaven and earth, making it difficult for the light of heaven and earth to bear, and it was about to collapse. An indescribable sense of terror surged wildly from the bottom of his heart, and he almost could not help but use various means brought by his corresponding existences on other levels. Chapter 23:03. Puff! With a soft sound, the palm that the Tao Sovereign's disciple had sent towards Luo Fan had already disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. Obviously, it had been broken up by the rough young man. As for what mysteries were hidden in that slap, and what kind of method that straightforward young man used to block that slap, it was not something that Luo Fan could know at this moment. Can you stop it? The Tao Master's disciple from a higher level sneered and said. Then, his figure flashed, and he rushed straight towards Luo Fan. Such a rushing posture was extremely mysterious. In Luo Fan's eyes, His figure seemed to have completely disappeared, leaving no trace, and there was not a trace of fluctuation around, as if he had completely disappeared from the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. However, in contrast to his disappearance, Luo Fan felt an indescribable strong sense of crisis shrouding him. His light of heaven and earth, his world view, and the infinite power in his body all told him that if he did not respond accordingly, what awaited him was death. Puff, 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 the rough young man sneered and disappeared. At the same time as his disappearance, there were countless indescribable strange fluctuations around Luo Fan's body, which were almost as large as the huge vortex he had created. These fluctuations were like some kind of unimaginable power erupting in the depths of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. The continuous eruption gave birth to endless world clusters, produced endless destructive power, and even caused deep destruction in the depths of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path. Small holes, similar to the holes that led straight to the state of chaos when the Tao Master's path was invaded, constantly emerged and quickly closed. At this moment, the infinite power of the Tao Master's prison descended on this level and began to sweep and search the boundless vortex around the world cluster of Luo Fan. However, this method of searching that was supposed to be successful was unable to find its target at all. It was as if there was nothing there. It was only scanning the area again and digging deeper again and again. Is this the battle between the experts of the 7th and 8th level? At this moment, Luo Fan felt an indescribable shock in his heart. He had already known that the Tao Master's disciple and the rough young man were quite extraordinary, but now that he saw their real strength, he was still shocked. After all, this was a level so profound that he couldn't see it or understand it at all. Is there really no way to see through their actions? A kind of unwillingness emerged from the bottom of Luo Fan's heart at this time. For him, who had even comprehended the mysteries of the true saint, this kind of existence that was beyond his understanding was obviously not something he was willing to accept. To him, allowing this kind of thing to continue was a kind of humiliation. At that moment, his mind turned, and he began to think of a way to understand the battle between the two of them. At least he had to see it. First, he thought of his idea on other levels. Although the battle in front of him happened in the real level, according to the mysterious connection between levels, there should be similar changes in all other levels. The only difference was that because of the difference in levels, the same method would inevitably have some changes, big or small, between different levels. Then, they would need to undergo some kind of subtle transformation in order to transform into the various mysteries in the real world. With this idea, Luo Fan's perception began to communicate with his corresponding existences in each level, and with the help of these existences, he began to explore each level. This probing action made him feel helpless. That's because although there were two experts on every level, there were two of them. They were also fighting in the same way on that level. However, it was a pity that, similar to the real level, in the many levels Luo Fan still could not see through their battle, let alone understand the various mysteries revealed in the process of their battle. It was the same on the conceptual level, the karma level, the illusion level. It was the same on all other levels. Although there is no special research, just the improvement of the realm alone has actually reached this level. Indeed, he is worthy of being a powerhouse above the 6th layer. After experiencing it from the beginning to the end, Luo Fan finally couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. At present, the feedback from various levels had already told him that it was obviously impossible to experience the battle between the two of them through other levels. At this moment, Luo Fan could only retract his gaze from other levels and look at the real level in front of him again. His mind turned, and countless ideas and possibilities emerged from the depths of his heart. As various methods continued to take shape, he rejected them again and again. Finally, at a certain moment, he had a flash of inspiration. He looked at the deep and unpredictable 4th level of the road of Tao Master and thought to himself, I am still the real master of this 4th level. How could I forget that there is still such a method? As he thought of this, his perception began to gradually change. The general trend of the fourth level of the road of Tao Master that he could not see before began to appear in front of him. Compared to before, the connection between him and these forces was much closer. His control over them had also become much stronger. This situation clearly showed that his identity as a master was more deeply rooted in people's hearts than before. Luo Fan was not surprised by the emergence of this situation. This was because he had already expected this to happen when he used the light of heaven and earth to send the minds of all the cultivators on the fourth level to that side of the world to control their destinies. At this moment, his mind merged with the general situation and began to condense the power of the general situation. Gradually, the originally scattered, boundless general situation gathered towards where he was. Gradually, the general situation turned into a brilliance that piled up above his head. This kind of general trend itself was invisible and intangible and could not even be called an existence. It could only be said to be an abstract manifestation. However, at this time, under Luo Fan's control, these forces turned from illusory to real and became a kind of treasure-like existence that floated above his head, giving him a kind of incomparably sacred feeling that he didn't have before. As this boundless general trend condensed, all the other cultivators on the fourth level felt as if something had suddenly been taken away from them, and the depths of their hearts suddenly became much emptier. On the other hand, Luo Fan felt as if he had suddenly grown many times stronger. From his original size, he had risen to a terrifying state that could fill the heavens and earth. It was not the true growth of his body, but the growth of his own sense of existence. At this moment, the Tao Sovereign's disciple and the rough young man who were fighting were also attracted by this unimaginable sense of existence. The two of them, who were originally fighting smoothly, suddenly paused at this moment, for gazes were cast at Luo Fan from all directions, making him feel as if all his secrets had been seen through. Instinctively, the general trend that floated above his head that was like a treasure light trembled slightly, and the gazes were instantly cut off. The feeling of all his secrets being peeped at naturally disappeared without a trace. What an exquisite method! The rough young man's praise was heard. It's just an unorthodox method. The Tao Sovereign's disciple's voice was heard along with the rough young man's. However, this was all the words the two of them said. Next, their battle began again. It was still extremely smooth, and it even felt like the scale was much larger than before. Luo Fan naturally did not care about their evaluation. At this moment, with the help of the general trend, his eyes began to shine brightly. All kinds of things that he could not see through before began to gradually appear in his eyes. The rough young man and the Tao Sovereign's disciple, who were originally difficult to see through, were gradually revealed in his eyes. Boom! At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if there were billions of thunderbolts exploding in his heart out of nowhere. His entire mind was shaken to the point that it went blank. It was because the mysteries displayed during the battle between the rough young man and the Tao Sovereign's disciple were too profound. It was to the extent that just by looking at them, Luo Fan had already received endless information and comprehended endless mysteries that he had not comprehended before. After a long while, when Luo Fan struggled to break free from the blank state of mind and recover his complete thinking, he found that the depth of the information was beyond his imagination. They were even more profound, unfathomable, and incomprehensible than what the will of the world inside the light of heaven and earth transmitted from the perspective of the will of heaven and earth. With Luo Fan's current realm and his comprehension ability, although he knew that there must be endless principles and endless mysteries contained within it, he was still unable to comprehend it. However, this was as far as he could go. If he wanted to obtain more, it would be impossible. Even so, at this moment, he had already felt that the arrival of his sixth tribulation had been brought forward by several years. Even though it wasn't much, it still represented that his cultivation had risen a step further. And this also made Luo Fan understand that if he could see through and understand all the mysteries revealed in the battle between the rough young man and the Tao Sovereign's disciple, his cultivation realm would definitely be improved beyond imagination. This is still not enough. Then I have to trigger the will of heaven and earth. As he thought of this, the light of heaven and earth that had originally covered his body like a living creature began to slowly retract, turning back into a ball of light that appeared above his head. It stood side by side with the treasure light formed by the great force, making it look like there were two pearls on top of his head. Then, the will of heaven and earth inside the light of heaven and earth began to surge, and wisps of strange fluctuations were shot in all directions, heading towards the entire fourth level of the Tao Master's path. If it had been an ordinary fluctuation, it would have been helpless against the attacks that had penetrated into the deepest part of the fourth level of the road of Tao Master, and had even broken the road of Tao Master into a state of chaos, let alone invading it. Even approaching a certain range of the road of Tao Master would be shredded and destroyed. But now, it was clear that the fluctuations coming from the light of heaven and earth were a kind of probing fluctuation that belonged to the will of heaven and earth. This kind of fluctuation was so mysterious that even Luo Fan could not understand it. There was no need to mention its subtlety and strength. At this moment, these fluctuations almost completely ignored the impact that could even break the Tao Master's path and directly penetrated into the battlefield between the rough young man and the Tao Master's disciple, and directly saw their figures fighting. In an instant, endless information appeared inside the light of heaven and earth, and poured into Luo Fan's heart through the connection between the light of heaven and earth, and became his memory. The amount of information was incomparably huge. It was even thousands of times more information than what he had obtained with the help of the general trend before. However, just like before, this information was also strange and profound beyond imagination. Even if he clearly knew where they came from, even if he clearly knew what this information represented, he couldn't obtain any useful information from this information at all. It was as if this was just a messy, disorderly chaotic information without any content. Sure enough, looking at the endless information, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. This was the reason why he did not use the will of heaven and earth to explore what he could not see before. Although the will of heaven and earth was incomparably mysterious and could even understand all kinds of things in the state of chaos, there should be no problem for it to see through the battle between the Tao Master's disciple and the rough young man. However, the difference between his way of thinking and that of the will of heaven and earth was really too big. Even if the will of heaven and earth tried its best to cooperate with him and make the information into a state that he could understand, it was still difficult for him to understand. In contrast, it was possible to understand it with the help of the general trend. This was the fundamental reason why he had made the choice just now. At this time, after Luo Fan sighed, he did not immediately begin to immerse his mind into the countless pieces of information to comprehend the various mysteries of these pieces of information and to dig out the many hidden principles of cultivation. Chapter 23:04. When these two types of information were mixed together, it was naturally impossible for there to be any seamless integration. It instantly became incomparably smooth, and all the confusion completely disappeared. Music, literature, novel in reality, at this moment, the information instantly became even more chaotic. It was even more chaotic than when the two were in an independent state. This was to be expected. There was actually no connection between the will of the universe within the light of the universe and the light condensed from the general trend. Under such circumstances, how could the two of them complement each other and work together? However, seeing this, Luo Fan did not feel disappointed. In the first place, he did not expect to be able to reveal all the principles and mysteries in the information as soon as he mixed the two together. At this moment, waves of his consciousness continuously flowed into the light formed by the light of the universe and the general trend above his head, allowing his consciousness to adjust the two and adjust the relationship between them. This caused the countless information that poured into his mind through the two to undergo various subtle changes in the process. With this change, the extremely chaotic information in his mind also began to change. Most of the changes in the information were in a more chaotic direction. However, there was also a small trend, or rather, for a short period of time, these changes would change in an orderly direction. However, this was inevitable. If two completely incompatible individuals were to overlap, and if they were to coincide, there would naturally be a higher chance that the two of them would have no similarities at all. However, if adjustments were made, there would ultimately be some details that could be adjusted to fit together. This was just like the information transmitted by the will of the universe and the general trend light at this moment. At a certain moment, when Luo Fan adjusted the two types of information to a certain state, an indescribable and intermittent order directly appeared among the countless information. Through this order, Luo Fan instantly felt that his mind was ringing with morning bells and evening drums. It was as if his mind had become incomparably clear in an instant. Many mysteries that were originally still vague had become incomparably clear in the blink of an eye. In an instant, his cultivation realm began to rise at a visible rate, and his worldview that could only be perfected a little after a long time also began to be perfected at an unimaginable speed. It was as if they had all become an empty water tank, and at this moment, there was endless fresh water constantly pouring into this water tank from the outside. With this improvement, Luo Fan's eyes became misty. Faintly, he could already vaguely see the scene of the battle between the rough youth and the disciples of the Tao Master through his eyes. He saw them constantly changing positions and postures in this area that was not much different from the huge whirlpool. With this change, the countless information in his mind began to automatically change at this moment. Amidst these changes, the originally chaotic appearance began to gradually change. The little bits of order that could only occasionally appear began to increase, and the area that they occupied became wider and wider. And in this way, the mysteries revealed from the battle between the rough youth and the disciples of the Tao Master revealed more and more. This situation obviously started a perfect virtuous cycle, causing Luo Fan's cultivation realm to rise bit by bit. And the time for his sixth tribulation also continued to advance in this process. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. And in this process, time also continued to pass bit by bit. For existences at their level, time had already become an existence similar to an attribute, let alone for the experts at a higher level. Obviously, for the rough youth and the disciples of the Tao Master, the time of battle was completely meaningless to them. Whether it was an instant, 100 million years, or 1 billion years, the weight in their hearts was not much different. In this process, in Luo Fan's perception, tens of millions of years had passed unknowingly. And during this period of time, the battle that affected an extremely wide range was still going on unhurriedly, as if there was no difference compared to the beginning. Compared to their battle, after such a long time, Luo Fan also felt that his cultivation realm had made unimaginable progress. Although watching them fight still could not be as clear as facing the battle of existences at the same level, it was already many times clearer than before. At least, when he looked at them again, it was only a little blurry. If he paid attention to one of the key points, he would be able to see some key points clearly. In contrast to this change in perspective, his cultivation realm had already improved a lot compared to before. The perfection of his worldview was already an improvement that could be seen by almost any ordinary person. At this moment, Luo Fan's body was already filled with an indescribable aura. It was an extremely subtle and repelling aura that the fourth level could no longer accommodate. The existence of this aura almost made people feel that in the next moment, Luo Fan would be repelled out of the fourth level and into the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. The power of the Tao Master's purgatory, which had descended because of the battle between the rough-looking young man and the disciples of the Tao Master, began to gather around his body, as if it wanted to directly affect him, but could not do so due to some scruples. In addition to these changes in his body, there was another change that Luo Fan was more concerned about. That was the time when his sixth tribulation would descend. In his perception, the time when his sixth tribulation would descend had been reduced from the original 3 trillion years to 3 trillion years. This was more than 100 billion years ahead of time. It was easy to imagine the extent of his improvement. What a pity! At this moment, a sigh suddenly came from the mouth of the disciples of the Tao Master. Along with this sigh, the fierce battle that covered an area that was not much smaller than the area of the vortex suddenly came to a halt. Countless images, boundless power, and all sorts of movements caused by the impact of their battle completely disappeared in the blink of an eye, as if they had never appeared in the first place. It is indeed a pity. If my main body was here, this battle wouldn't have ended so indifferently. The boorish youth also spoke. Their voices contained a kind of indescribable regret at this moment, as if there was something that did not develop in accordance with their wishes and could not satisfy them. And from the content of their conversation, it could be seen that this was not in line with their wishes. What they couldn't satisfy was none other than the battle that had happened between the two of them. It was a battle that was enough to shock all the cultivators on the fourth floor. Even Luo Fan could feel that he had comprehended countless things from it at this moment. Such a battle is actually indifferent to them. Even though he had some speculations in his heart before, when he heard the confirmation from their mouths, Luo Fan was still a little shocked. It should be known that the horror of this battle could be seen from the disciples of the Tao Master and the rogue cultivators who were like cowards. And yet, such a battle seemed to be carried out by the two of them just to suppress him. Next time, let's fight with our bodies. The disciple of the Tao Master invited. When he heard this, the rough young man laughed and said, "Then forget it. It is too dangerous to fight with your body. I can't find any reason to take this risk." Sigh. The disciple of the Tao Master sighed and glanced at Luo Fan with a strange look in his eyes. Then, his figure slowly dissipated, and in the blink of an eye, he had disappeared without a trace, as if he had never appeared. At this time, the forthright young man also glanced at Luo Fan with a smile on his face and said, "Next, you can do it according to your own ideas. You don't have to care about anything else. Just now you want, right? Don't you care about his mission here?" Seeing that the rough youth seemed to be about to disappear, Luo Fan hurriedly said. Hearing this, the rough youth smiled again and said, "Of course I won. If I didn't win, why would he dissipate first? As for his mission here, you don't have to care about it. That's the big situation between us rogue cultivators and the disciples of the Tao Master. For you, it's still too far away. Knowing too much will only bring you harm." When Luo Fan heard this, a bitter smile appeared on his face, and he said, "This kind of attitude is really abhorrent. Haha, there's no other way. Your strength is here. If you want to know more and obtain more, then hurry up and become stronger." The forthright young man laughed heartily, and his figure gradually dissipated. In the blink of an eye, there was no trace of his existence in the fourth level. At the same time, the shockwaves from the battle between the rough young man and the Tao Sovereign's disciple began to rapidly dissipate. Unknowingly, it had already disappeared without a trace, causing the entire fourth level to return to how it was 10 million years ago. The rough young man and the Tao Sovereign's disciple from the higher echelons had yet to appear. Become stronger. How many years has it been since I've heard someone say this to me? Luo Fan sighed and murmured. Become stronger. When you become stronger, you'll be able to know what you want to know and obtain what you want to obtain. This kind of words was usually said to others. He didn't expect others to use it on him. This kind of feeling was quite strange to him. However, the battle between the two of them was just a strange existence that was not even comparable to a projection, but it had already taken him tens of millions of years to see it clearly. This was enough to prove that they were qualified to say such words to him. At that moment, although he was displeased, he could only suppress this displeasure and earnestly comprehend and absorb the various mysterious mysteries that he had obtained from the process of their battle. After the two of them dissipated, the power from the Tao Master's prison began to gradually disappear. Even the power that had been hovering around Luo Fan's body, as if it was looking for an opportunity to give Luo Fan a ruthless blow and pull Luo Fan into the depths of the Tao Master's prison, had also disappeared, as if it had never appeared. Sensing the disappearance of the power from the Tao Master's prison, Luo Fan only revealed a faint smile on his face, but did not say anything else. His current strength had clearly exceeded the range that the fourth level of the Tao Master's path could accommodate. Because of this, the power of the Tao Master's prison would appear around him, ready to pull him into the depths of the Tao Master's prison and suppress him. However, he was indeed a cultivator on the fourth level. His ascension process on the Tao Master's path had indeed led him to the fourth level. Under such circumstances, no matter how powerful he was or how terrifying the power he had obtained, it was in line with the rules of the Tao Master's path. In this way, it was impossible for the power of the Tao Master's prison to pull him into the depths of the Tao Master's prison and suppress him. It could only obediently watch him stay here and watch him obtain more resources and improve even more. Of course, the prerequisite was that he would not be expelled from the fourth level of the Tao Master's path before he completed the prerequisite of ascension and be forcefully sent to the fifth level. Given the current direction of development, there was a high possibility of such a situation happening. With a thought, the light that was condensed from the power began to disperse once again. In the blink of an eye, it had expanded from a small ball to several tens of feet in size. Its brightness also began to weaken as it expanded. It looked as if the light had been dispersed into the area within a radius of several tens of feet. The area that the power occupied continued to expand, and its brightness continued to weaken. Not long after, the aura had once again dispersed to every inch of the fourth level of the Tao Master's path, and its brightness had completely disappeared. Not even the slightest bit could be seen. But this was the general trend returning to its original state. With the recovery of the power, all the cultivators on the fourth level suddenly felt a sense of fullness, as if their long-lost existence had suddenly returned.